Hello. This one worked. This time it didn't ask me for a password. The last time I clicked on the link and it did. Who knows why?
I don't know. I do
I
know
don't
that
have
I do know
idea.
that I purchased this account, so I'm paying my 20 bucks a month US to Zoom Corporation now. But that was not only because of you. I mean, I had a call I think a week ago and I wanted to make sure that I had enough people. Can you turn your camera on?
Oh, let me see. I'm just looking for a little camera icon. Ah, there we go. Camera icon. There we are.
Well, hi, how are you doing?
Oh, not bad. It's fairly early in the morning, so I'm just waking up. But well, I have been up for a while, but I'm always a little bit. I get very into the news in the morning, and so it takes me a while to sort of get fully into gear.
Can you tilt your screen down a little bit so your eyes are about a third of the way from the top of the screen? Yeah,
Like
that's
that?
better. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I didn't know, do you have that light that you used before so we could see you a little bit better?
I will ask Kai. Kai? Aaron was wondering if there's an extra light that's possible. So there's a light from the builder's market, but it's 500 watts. And apparently Kai said he put it on last time. I was wondering why it was absolutely melting. Because it's summer here. It was already like 24 degrees and there's a 500-watt lamp on.
Well,
so we can try, but I might have to turn it off if I get far too hot again.
Your color is not bad. It's just it looks a bit dark. Like my face is much.
I'll open a blind. That might help. It will sidelight me, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, 3-point lighting. You're supposed to have two lighting sources in front and one behind, and that's how things are meant. I have 3 lights on. I have this one here. I have that one there.
Slightly odd lighting.
Yeah, that looks much better.
Okay, that works then. I just hope I don't melt. Because Kai's put the builder's lamp on.
Okay.
And I've opened the blind, so that's why I'm lit from the side. Does that puts a lot more light on me?
Yeah, that's good.
All coming from over there.
Yeah, I look kind of washed out actually. I mean, I should have a stronger. I mean, I don't want to go this bright on this side though. I think that's a little too much.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. I like the background.
Oh, thank you.
I still haven't figured out how to change backgrounds on Zoom. Is that only with the paid version?
No, actually, you can do that with any version. You just, where it says stop video, just to the right of that, you click on the chevron, the up chevron, and then you click on choose virtual background, and then it should say something like choose virtual background, none. And that's what you're on. So, and then there's a little plus to the right, and you hover over the plus, it says add image. You click on that and click on add image, and then you can pick basically whatever you want. So if I want to show you my new local currency, there's my new local currency. Wow, isn't that fancy? Or this morning I was using this one.
Oh, that's nice.
And
so are they your own images, or does it give you images to choose from?
Well, it depends. If you have the paid version, you can do something that's called a virtual background. This is actually a green screen. So I have to click on the little button that says I have a green screen. And then I can select these images to go in the background. But if you have a really robust computer, which I actually have a laptop, which I just bought, but I have not tried it on that. But that will actually, the computer will trace for each frame that it brings in, it will trace your outline. And then as you move, it will trace your outline, and it will paint in whatever you want in the back, and that's called a virtual background, which is not the same as the green screen. The green screen doesn't require as much processing power. And that's pretty.
Guy's computer would do that. He has a top-of-the-line graphics card because he's a gamer. But my computer is, I think it's about 8 years old, and it doesn't have a graphics card as far as I know, so definitely not for me.
Well, it has a graphics card. It's probably just integrated.
Well, just nothing fancy anyway.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a gamer at all.
All right, so shall we have a little chat, and I can record it and we can put it on YouTube, and you can share it and I can share it, and
sure.
All right. So well, what do you want to talk about today first? Because maybe we can make sure we're going in the right direction.
Well, I mean, I'm open to suggestion. I've been looking at so many different things. I
Okay,
mean,
well,
my focus has been the virus and things, but I mean, there's so much else going on as well. I
right,
don't necessarily get into the same depth with everything all the time
sure,
because it depends. Sometimes when my focus is very heavily on one thing, the other things become something I keep track of a bit more superficially.
yeah,
But I mean, I'm always taking it in. So whatever
great.
you want to ask,
Well,
really.
let's, one of the things I did with David uh, Korowitz this morning was I asked him just like 3 questions. And the first 2 questions took up 13 minutes. And then the next question took up like 12 minutes. And I cut those apart. And let me see if I can show you.
David is so awesome. He just
Yes.
gets it to the nth degree.
Well, and he said he was going to watch this with you too, because he likes to hear the things that you have to say as well. So I appreciate that you guys are all kind of on board. But
I stayed with him several times when I was in Dublin. We know each other pretty well.
oh, okay, I did not know that. That's very cool. Let me see if I can share this. So here's my screen too. So what I did this morning after I talked with him is his one question. The one question I asked him was, "What do people need to know?" And then he needed to like give me a little bit of examples. So I asked him like a follow-up, and then I later asked him, "What can I do now? What should I be doing? What can I be doing?" And so he gave a couple of nice answers. The first one, he was basically talking about systems fragility, and then the second one he was talking more about, well, start where you are and do what you can from where you are and where you have agency. So and especially start with yourself, your own mental health. So I thought that was kind of nice advice. But here's some of the questions I kind of wrote down for you. And this can just be not even necessarily a starting place, but just some ideas. So when we talked last, you said that things were scheduled to be opened up by the 23rd of April, and now it's the 24th for you. So I want to ask that one.
Okay, sure.
What's changed in the last 2.5 weeks? I think there's 2 ways to look at that. One is from outside your household, and the other one is inside your household.
Yeah.
And again, it could circle back to those questions that I asked David, like, what do people need to know? And I know you love kind of forecasting how we're getting closer to utopia or dystopia or whatever. I could even ask you something like, Nicole, what are your probabilities on we make it to utopia, we make it to dystopia, or we make it to back to the way it was? And that might be kind of a nice way to frame it. So maybe I should put that like utopia / dystopia / same, and because that's kind of like the continuum, right? And what should a person do? Oh, and then the one that I think would be really interested is the Richie Riches. And apparently some of them have bugged out to the South Island from the US. And
Peter Thiel is the one that comes to mind.
Yeah. So, and I didn't know if you had any sense at all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any of the other names. Well, I think James Cameron has a place here and Peter Thiel, but I'm sure there are others. I just don't know who they would be.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the thing that bothers me about Peter Thiel is that he bought his citizenship. So if people want to come here and they want to apply and follow the same rules as everybody else, I haven't got a problem with it at all. But if people just want to say, I have a lot of money, so let me in and give me citizenship right away, then I don't approve of that.
Well, this kind of goes back to this essay. It's not really an essay. I've been collecting all these stories about the Richie Riches bugging out, and also I've collected the stories about the people who are starving to death in India and Africa and those sorts of impoverished, I guess you could say. I don't know the way to say it in a nice way. And there's that, the huge difference, between the two. We got the people that are, even in the US, people are still flying around. Like there's this website you can go to and you can pull up and it shows you every single airplane that's in the air over the US. And a lot of them are like these little passenger planes, like single engine planes, just flying around. you know, they're going up to northern Michigan. They're going wherever they want to go, to their little golf courses, between their houses, you know, whatever. And so there's these Richie Riches, and oh yeah, in Michigan, the richest Richie Riches are the ones who are behind the rallies.
Oh, absolutely, the DeVos family.
Yes.
And Prince.
Oh,
yes, definitely.
And they live just 30 minutes from here. And
this is an AstroTurf campaign. This drive to get, it's an AstroTurf campaign. It's not grassroots. It's fake grassroots funded by rich people.
Yes.
So,
and so the owners want us back to work because
yes.
Oh, they can't get their nice meals now, or they can't, their income is suffering, or I don't exactly know. I mean, I know they want their workers, their wage slaves, back to work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not entirely sure why. You know, do they want more control? Are they imagining they're going to be the oligarchs in control of everything? And I mean, there's already like the deep state or the dark state or whatever. And I don't know how much you subscribe to that idea, I guess.
Not particularly.
Right.
I mean, there's a certain amount of momentum in any bureaucracy. So bureaucracies are really meant to be like a sea anchor, so that things don't change too drastically in one direction or the other. So they're supposed to provide continuity. You know, the politicians come and go. I don't know if you ever watched Yes Minister, but if not, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a television series from Britain in the 1980s, I think. It's all about how government works. And so you have the minister, his private secretary, and the cabinet secretary for his department, so the head of the civil service for his department. And the dynamic between the politician and the civil service is brilliant. It's one of the best television shows ever put on. I think Margaret Thatcher once said, "Don't bother to take government and politics, just watch Yes Minister." And the people who wrote it, Yes Minister, and then the next series is Yes Prime Minister, because he ends up being prime minister as well. It's absolutely brilliant, looking at how the sausage of politics is made and all the trade-offs, and it's hilarious as well. But yes, I mean, so bureaucracies are meant to slow things down.
Okay, but let's not go into these great details, because these would be better to have like inside the publishable part. Hey, can you tilt it even more down a little bit? Yeah, there? That's better. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to let you do the intro of yourself this time. I'll introduce myself. You introduce yourself, and then we'll start with the conversation. I really like the idea of starting where we were. You know, last time we spoke, you said that April 23rd was the date.
Yep.
It was the date, and that was 2.5 weeks ago. So, and then if you can try not to bounce on the table, because that bounces your
Yes, I will try very hard to keep my hands to myself. I just tend to lean forward on things, and but I'll try not to.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Hello, I'm Nicole Foss.
Oh, wait. Let me do my intro first, then you do your.
Sure. Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Hello, this is Aaron Wissner with Local Future, and I'm here on the line with Nicole Foss. Nicole is in New Zealand. Nicole, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you. It's nice and early in the morning, new day.
Nicole, can you tell the viewers, like, what is your background? What is your interest in all of this stuff going on?
How long do you have?
Short, like short. A couple sentences.
Well, so I run a website at the moment called Applied Systems Thinking, which is at fossblog.com. I haven't written a great deal for a while, but that's where all my work is collected. So my background is really interdisciplinary. It's biology, it's law, it's energy, it's finance, environmental consultancy, a whole range of different things. And so what I do now is pull it all together. So of all the different fields that I've been working in, I pick out the important points to draw everything together into the biggest possible big picture. And that's what I've been trying to do for probably 35 years, something like that, getting on for 40 even.
Are you trying to be like a polymath or something, Nicole?
I think I ended up being one. I wasn't trying to, but that seems to be what happened.
Well,
I'm just too interested in everything to settle on just one thing. And so to me, the interesting thing is always how everything fits together. I mean, there's absolutely a role for both kinds of people who go deep down the rabbit hole in one area and really tease apart all the details. And then there are people who just look at what those people have done in a whole range of different fields and draw it all together. And you absolutely need both, because if you only had people who have my way of looking at things, there would never be the depth to really be able to do it properly, because the depth would not have been explored. Whereas if you only have people who go for depth and you have no breadth, you don't have any way to connect things, and you lose so much explanatory power if you don't look at how things fit together. So this is the side of things I've chosen to be on, which makes me in some ways jack of all trades.
So
And
this
some
is
people
this
say
is kind
master
of
none.
this is kind of an opportunity then for, I mean, this time in history for people to, even though they're specialized in these certain, you know, they have these certain skills, to see how much they can open up,
Oh, yes.
because
Yeah.
that's where they're going to start seeing stuff they never saw before.
Absolutely. I mean, for instance, when I was at the oil drum, and there were mostly people who were engineers and geologists, and they were brilliant. The knowledge they brought to that website was absolutely unparalleled. But at the same time, there were things that some of them didn't see because they were looking at their field and not more broadly than that. So I've been called in my life a peak oiler who doesn't understand peak oil, because I said, oil prices are going to fall off a cliff. And people said, well, you couldn't understand peak oil, because if you did, then you would know that they would only ever go up. And you have to understand the fundamentals of oil, but you also have to understand finance and herding behavior in order to be able to see how those things fit together. Because if you don't have all the factors that are essential for seeing what's going to happen, then you always end up being wrong. A whole lot of people went long oil in in the last crisis, and
Me,
probably a lot of them lost their shirts.
I did, and I didn't know what I was so. I thought for sure, because I mean, oil is this most valuable thing. It has all this energy. It has these molecules that are amazing. And so it's got to be worth more and more and more and more. But that's not the basis on which value is calculated in this sort of an economy.
Prices do not reflect the fundamentals. People think that they do. There's this people believe in the efficient market hypothesis, and that the market automatically correctly prices everything all the time. Bull. No way. That is not what markets do. I mean, most people haven't got a clue about the fundamentals when they're investing in things. Not the insiders, but most people who are investing are chasing momentum. They don't understand the fundamentals. They just see something going up and they think, this is going up, somebody must know what they're talking about, I'm going to buy some too, I don't want to miss out. Fear of missing out is huge. Market sentiment is huge.
So this is all
So
just speculation, just
yes,
trusting somebody else, or just trusting the market
yes,
that, hey, it's going up, it's going to keep going up. Hey, it's going to go down, it's going to keep going down. Hey, it's volatile, it's going to get more volatile. Or hey, it's, you know, whatever. Because you can bet on any of these things, right? You can do like the little V-shaped bets and W-shaped
yeah,
bets and the upside down
you can.
W's and all these bets.
Yeah, and there are people who understand the fundamentals and bet on that, and they don't necessarily win because the fundamentals don't set prices. And there are a whole lot of other people who are just looking for momentum, looking for something that's going up to try and make a capital gain. And so the market dynamics are hugely grounded in sentiment and human herding behavior on the way up and on the way down. And what you tend to get when supply and demand get tight, you don't get a one-way moonshot. You get huge volatility because people are afraid. And the people who are making the actual bets, who aren't just so afraid they're sitting back and doing nothing, but the people who are actually involved in the market, they don't know whether things are going to go up. Then they do, should I buy the dip? Should I not try and catch a falling knife? These are all those sort of ways that people think. You know, but because you have some people who take one decision, some take another, you get these huge swings. So in the 30s, you had not only the biggest falls in market history, you had the biggest rises as well. So the VIX, for instance, the volatility index, is the fear index. When fear is in control because there's a perception that supply and demand are tight, then you get this huge volatility.
But now we
And
have the opposite, right? It's not supply and demand are tight. Like with oil, oil went down. It was $40, negative $40
Yes.
per barrel per contract. And
Mm.
who expected that to be coming? I mean, who won out on that deal? I mean, I don't know that any of the traders could have possibly, I mean, maybe they did, but wow. I mean,
The one I can think of is Mike Maloney, who invested in oil tanker capacity because he saw the squeeze coming and he thought people are going to need to rent oil tankers to store this stuff. So yes, some people were perceptive enough, but you often have to be indirect about it. But when I was talking about supply and demand being tight, I was really talking about the last financial crisis when people were all going long oil and thinking it could only ever go up. And that was when there was the perception that supply and demand were tight. And the interesting thing, it's not actually the reality that matters. It's only the perception. It doesn't matter if it's true. It only matters if people believe it. And commodities top on fear of shortages. So on the way up, you go way above what the fundamentals would justify at that particular time, because people are speculating, thinking it can only ever go up, so I'll get in on it now, and up and up and up it goes in a speculative loop. And then it overshoots to the upside, and then you get speculators shorting it, saying, oh, it must be overvalued now, and you'll short it. Then you start, when you move into a depression, you start to get a demand collapse, and that's when you get the undershoot. But in this case, because of what the virus has done, the virus has dropped demand so much faster than anything else would have done, that it's playing out really quickly. So my long-standing forecast for where oil might go to in a depression was about $20 a barrel. And I got really laughed at for that. But I had never thought it would go down to minus 40. And I still don't think it would have done without things happening this quickly, because the dynamic for that was a storage squeeze. And that's what happens when everything happens really, really quickly. There's just no time to adapt. So you get all kinds of crunches. And that's what ended up happening with this. So there was a desperate attempt to get rid of the oil contract, because if you didn't get rid of it, you were going to have to take physical delivery. And if you don't have any storage place, that's a huge issue. So people started desperately saying, I'll pay you to take it off my hands because I don't have anywhere to put it.
hey, Nicole, if you had, let's just say hypothetically, you had been given $1,000 Canadian or US or New Zealand, whatever, and you had to put that in something that was not a household, like hard goods. You know, you had to put it in something. I'm sure people are like wondering, what would Nicole do? What would she do with this $1,000? I mean, what would she speculate on? What would she say? Oh, that's a sure bet. I should definitely do that.
I actually wouldn't speculate on anything.
Why not?
I would hang on to it.
There must be something.
Well, I honestly don't think I would, because what you really need in a depression, which is absolutely what we're moving into, you need the actual cash. Because the thing is, we haven't seen the kind of shortages that are going to come through yet. They're going to be huge, and they're not necessarily predictable. Farmers are destroying food. We're not hungry yet, but what happens the next season? There are going to be a whole lot of things, supply chains that are destroyed, for instance. So we don't know what we're not going to have, and we don't know what we're desperately going to need. So what I would do is hang on to it and say, I will make a decision down the line when I have more information as to what will be really important. Because if I make all my decisions up front, then I have sort of lost all my ammunition, if you like. I won't be able to take advantage of opportunities that come down the line later on. And I wouldn't be able to avoid downsides that take money to avoid either. So I would just hang on to my little handful of choices and wait until I knew more. But there's nothing I would speculate on.
But what about if I bought some gold? I mean, gold would be good, and I could go to the city, and I could go to the coin dealer, and I could buy some gold, or maybe I've got a buddy and I could buy some gold, and even if it's $3,000 an ounce US or whatever, 2,000, at least I have my little gold coin. Wouldn't that be a good idea, Nicole?
Well, it totally depends on your circumstances. And in the framing that you put, I would say no, because that framing suggests that you're an ordinary person with an ordinary kind of life who just wants a little tiny bit of security somehow. But most people who are ordinary people living an ordinary life would have a mortgage, and they might not have a lot of cash. They might live paycheck to paycheck and things. So they have much bigger problems to deal with before they ever start thinking about gold. So you have to get out of debt, because debt will kill you in a deflation. You need to have a certain amount of cash on hand, because cash is your ability to make choices later on. You don't want to give up that ability if you can possibly manage not to. So I have a list that I would go through as to things, the order of things to do. And so get out of debt is number one, hold cash is number two, and then maintain or gain some control over the essentials of your own existence, and maybe start a business so that you're tied in with your neighbors and you're providing some kind of essential service, local supply chains, local distribution network. If you've already done all of that, and you have money burning a hole in your pocket, by all means buy gold. I mean, all the big investors are talking about gold. I mean, Mike Maloney, for instance, he's a brilliant guy, but his forecasts are for people who have enormous amounts of money. So what you do if you have enormous amounts of money are very different from what you do if you are an ordinary person. And that's the thing I find frustrating, that if you really watch all the financial advice, the things that people are talking about, for the most part, it's not addressed to people who just live an ordinary life. So if you follow that advice, you can get into real trouble. Now, having said that, the one thing that might be worth buying, if you've done everything like that, I don't think I would buy gold. I think at the bottom of the list, I would buy silver. Not because silver will necessarily hold its value as well as gold over the long term, but because you might be able to use it directly without having to go through cash first. If you have gold, you're probably going to have to sell it, get cash, and then use the cash for whatever you want. Because
well, and I have to say, just for a moment, I think those of us who are the proletariat should refuse to accept gold in exchange for anything. Like, really, I mean, we should say, nope, I'm so sorry, Mr. Richie Rich, Mrs. Richie Rich. That is, I can't eat that, and I'm not giving you my food. I'm not giving you my labor.
Oh, absolutely.
You got to give me something real, like food, medicine. That's what I want. I don't want your little chunks of golden metal. That's nothing.
That's why it's at the very bottom of the list for ordinary people, because exactly all the other things are more important. Clean water, food, energy, you know, a bicycle or something, like all these basic things that make life possible and more comfortable than it otherwise would be. Those are all so much more important for ordinary people than owning gold. So gold is sort of what you do, or precious metals in general are what you do if you still have money left over after you've already done everything else, which already means that you're not talking to a whole lot of people at that point. But there can be, for people who genuinely can spare a little bit more, maybe they're older and they've paid off their house a long time ago, they don't have any debt, maybe they live on a farm. You know, there are people who would have a little bit of extra and who could put it into silver, because silver is undervalued relative to gold at the moment. So there is an argument for that. But personally, I think especially if you live in a rural area, there's absolutely no point, because you won't be able to get to anywhere to trade the stuff. So if you live in town, there are going to be currency markets, or real markets for selling gold and silver. They might end up being black markets if precious metals are outlawed for private ownership, which they were in the Depression, and they could be
think
again.
they should be. Just like last time, I think they should be. Because I don't want the billionaires, and the billionaires and millionaires know who they are. I don't want them coming to anybody, my neighbors or anybody, with this piece of gold and saying, oh, this is money now.
Yeah. And people in the country, so if you don't have a weighing scale, one of these scales that tells you exactly what an ounce of something should weigh, you're not going to know if it's real, or if it might be gold-plated tungsten. Someone could be having you on. I mean, people aren't going to trust that. So there's not just the fact that they can't eat it. They're not even necessarily going to trust that it's real in the first place, or would have any kind of value. So I think unless you are a reasonably wealthy person living in a reasonably urbanized area where you have some means to trade these, I don't think it makes much sense. And even if you do, it's going to be risky. So if you have this stuff and you end up getting hungry, which a lot of people who have gold but still have debt and no cash are going to find, they're going to end up selling it at distressed prices for next to nothing. So it's not even going to be worth very much to them. And that's a real problem. If you have to sell into a market at distressed prices, you will not get anything like what what you have is worth. It's only a store of value if you can hold it over 20, 30 years, not have to rely on the value it represents in the meantime, because then it will hold value. It has done for thousands of years. So it's not that it's not going to have any value. It will to somebody always. But but if you have to sell it in the meantime at distressed prices, you won't get the value that it's worth. So it's really only worth it if you're going to have it as an investment, but it's risky. If you're going to go out and try and trade a gold coin for some cash to buy food in a black market, someone might say, oh, this person appeared to have some gold. We'll just follow him home and see where that came from, see if there's any more. So you make yourself a target. If you own something that's too valuable that everyone is going to want, then you've painted a big target on your forehead if you ever admit you have it. And so if using it is to admit that you have it, then what on earth is the point? If you're just taking a store of value and basically burying it in the ground for 30 years, then I'm sure there are better things you could have done with that value in the meantime.
So I want to jump back to a thought that you said earlier, because I'm not sure that I agree, and I'd like to hear your perspective. So you said that if people are in debt, that they should focus on getting out of debt. But Steve Keen and others are going for this debt holiday or a debt jubilee, or people during the 2008 crash, they lost their houses, but then they all have houses again. So I don't know that it's as, I mean, I don't understand, I guess. I'm asking you. Help me understand why, say half of your house not being paid off, why is that better to pay down that debt than going out and getting a bunch of seeds to grow gardens and making your community garden and putting up some food, some staples, whatever staples that you can put up? It doesn't
There's a difference. There's a difference between paying down debt and getting out of debt. So what I'm saying is, if you possibly can, get out of debt. So if you have a mortgage, say your house, you have the capacity to pay down the mortgage of your house, but you've still got a 50% mortgage on it, or you manage to pay it down to 25%. Well, actually, banks are more likely to call in loans with low mortgages than high ones, because they have a better chance of being able to get some value out when they repossess your house. So it's not necessarily good enough to pay the mortgage down. What I would suggest is pay it off if you possibly can, even if that means selling the house and renting, which is exactly what we just did, by the way. So my partner had a house. We sold that because there was no way in the world we could pay off that mortgage, and we are now renting. So we no longer have any debt. We had debt before that we wouldn't have had any way to deal with. So we sold the house and got out of debt. And that has made an enormous difference. We're now in a vastly better position than we were before. And I mean, renting here isn't.
So what I'm hearing is, if someone had recently bought their house and like they had borrowed, so to speak, 90% of the value of the house, or 95% or 99% or whatever, and they still had that whole 30, 40, 50 years, then for them, obviously this isn't a possibility. So the importance for them of paying their mortgages is relatively less than for someone who is within striking distance of paying it off.
Yeah, so if you have a huge mortgage and you're in negative equity, then banks are not necessarily going to be in a rush to foreclose on you and resell the house. I mean, you'll end up with price discovery if you do that as a bank, and you won't get very much, because how are you going to recover the debt if the debt is larger than the value of the house?
For anybody that's not sure, what do you mean by price discovery, and why is that bad for banks?
So price discovery is when you sell something, when two people make a bargain on an asset, then that sets the price for that asset. So in terms of housing, when you sell, when there are comparable properties that are sold, that will set the value for the whole neighborhood. So this works on the way up and the way down. I mean, you get prices being bid up and up and up. And when there's one house on your street that suddenly goes for, say, $50,000 more than it did the last time, everybody's house on that street is now worth more. And the same thing happens on the way down. If one of your neighbors suddenly sells their house for $50,000 less than the prevailing area was worth, the prevailing area is now worth what that house sold for. So you see these things happen all the time. And when you actually have a huge amount of downward pressure on prices, then as soon as you encourage sales at those prices, you have repriced the entire asset class. And the bank's viability rests on the value of the mortgages that they've granted. So if the property prices crash, and it's obvious that they've crashed, then those banks, what the loans that they've made are going to be worthless. And those loans are somebody else's supposed asset. So you get in a huge amount of trouble when you start to ratchet down, especially when real estate is such a huge part of an economy. So when you have people who've been flipping houses, and you have all the renovations industry and the furnishings industry and everything else that you have absolutely booming for a while, and then the house prices start to drop, you can lose 15 to 20% of your GDP. So if the market just goes illiquid and people stop buying and selling at all, then you don't have price discovery. So people can still tell themselves that the houses are worth what they used to be, or they might even be able to tell themselves it's worth more because houses only ever go up, so they can assume that the thing is still going up even although the market is illiquid.
But this has to be inevitable though, right? Because
yes,
there's going to be somebody like right now in Michigan or New Zealand or whoever who has to get out of their house because
yes,
either the grandparents have died and they want to sell it, or they've divorced and they want to sell it, or they have to move. There's going to be people that are forced to sell and put it on the market, yes, and they're going to be forced to bring the price down until they get a sale, right? So it's yes, inevitable that this happens in this sort of situation where we're in right now.
Yes, it's absolutely inevitable. And it would have been inevitable even without the virus once the bubble burst. The normal way housing bubbles burst is the market goes illiquid, then some people are forced to sell, as you were saying, for a lower price, then the prices ratchet down, and people say, oh good, prices are falling, I'll just wait. And then the market goes illiquid again, someone else has to sell for an even lower price, and you just ratchet down over many years. But with the virus, this seems to be accelerating the timescales for the bursting of a bubble. Bubbles can burst really quickly anyway, not so much housing bubbles, but bubbles in financial assets, because financial assets are virtual. Those can reprice extremely quickly. But normally physical assets don't do that quite so quickly. But because this virus seems to be accelerating the timescale of the bursting of a bubble, there's just no time to adapt. And this is going to be a huge problem, because if you don't have really any time whatsoever to adapt, you get stuck in all these situations where you have to make really perverse sort of decisions, like paying someone to take oil off your hands or things like that.
So Nicole, I want to stop you there for a second, because maybe it's the wrong thing to do. Back during all these scientific discoveries, and then suddenly we find out that the science can be used for weaponry or making a nuclear bomb or whatever. Maybe this is information that people shouldn't know, because suppose I put this on the internet and suppose 10 or 20 people watch it and they realize, oh, they should put their house on the market right now. And then there's the herd mentality, which is, oh, we also should put the house on the market. And maybe it just becomes a meme, right? So it's not even they see this video or anything. It's just that now's the time to sell. It's the time to sell is right now. Even if you can't go.
That's exactly what people are going to try and do, but it's too late. That's the problem. So people aren't necessarily going to be able to get rid of a mortgage, because with all these lockdowns and people not moving around and people hanging on to their money for a rainy day because they've lost their job, the house market is going to crater. And so they're
crater by, like, what do you mean by crater? Like 50% down, 40% down, 70%? 90. So you're saying, so I looked on Zillow or Trulia or whatever we have in the US, and this house was close to 300,000, which was much higher than we purchased it for. We purchased it for $123,000 in $1997, and now it says, oh, you can sell it for 300,000. That doesn't even take into account the improvements we've made. Mm-hmm. So you're saying $30,000.
Yes, not immediately. It will still take time to go down that far. So you might get the first set of falls, it might go down 30, 40% quickly, But where I would suggest for some kind of lasting bottom or semi-lasting bottom is about 90% down on average. And this is true for most bubbles. That's where things go. So what you end up with, you have to go back to before the bubble began. There's always an undershoot. So if you look to before the bubble began, the prices will go up and then they crash to an undershoot and then they may go up again or they may stay flat. But the undershoot takes you back to where before the bubble began, and the bubble began.
Back in 2008, though, the prices went down in the U.S. only like by about 50, only like 50%.
Yes, but that wasn't the final bursting of a bubble. That was a correction in an upward trend. So things hadn't actually topped out at that point. There was the same thing happened in England in the late 80s, early 90s. Prices fell about 30%, and then they went to ridiculous highs. So that wasn't the final bursting of the bubble. But when this is very likely to be the final bursting of this bubble. And so what ends up happening is you will go back to before the bubble started. So you're looking at the asset prices of the 1970s. So what would your house have been worth in 75, for instance?
Well, I have no idea. The house wasn't
even built then. But yeah. I don't remember whether your house.
Well, and this is before. Isn't this before the world? I mean, the world was on a commodity standard until like 1972 or something, and then Nixon separated the U.S. dollar from the gold. And doesn't that make a difference? I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I mean, really, what separating the gold from the dollar and things, which is what Nixon did. I mean, this really set off this enormous credit bubble. That's where you had this enormous magnification of credit and debt. And it started off properly, I mean, as just a proper economic boom, because initially in a boom, you have self-liquidating debt. So people start to become confident enough to start businesses again. So they borrow money to invest in a business. They set up a productive asset that produces an income stream to pay down the debt. So self-liquidating debt is not a problem. That's the way economies normally work. When you have credit to sort of lubricate the economy, all sorts of things are possible, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Over time, we started investing our money in just anything, consumption. So, I think I'll just take a trip around the world or something like that, or I'll buy an enormous SUV because I'm compensating for something or whatever it might be. But then you haven't generated an income stream when you do that. You've burdened other income streams. And then later on, it gets even worse, where people start going wholesale for speculation. So it's just pure gambling at that point. So they're taking borrowed money and they're gambling with it, putting it into the market, saying, well, these things
Nicole,
go up.
It's surely not gambling. It's not like me going to the casino that's the native tribe owns 10 miles from now. It's not really the same as that, is it?
Well, it depends. For the housing market, no. But for the stock market and things like that, for financial assets, yes, it is exactly that.
It can't be because Nicole, people have 401ks and pensions in the stock market. It can't be the same as a casino. It can't.
Well, those people mostly don't control the assets that they have, and what they do control is such a tiny percentage of everything. Most of what's happening is big players with these fast algorithms and things trading all the time. It's all about bets on price movements of underlying assets. It's very, very divorced from anything that's real. So this is really the problem. This is why you have excess claims to underlying real wealth, because you have all these contracts that you can sell, say in the derivatives market. The derivatives market has no connection with actual underlying real wealth. It's just, I think this asset is going to do this. You think it's going to do that. One of us will pay the other, and if it goes in the direction that they believed it would go in. This is absolutely a casino. And it's a quadrillion-dollar casino in the derivatives market, approximately. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but of that order. So much of this is gambling. And if you look at pension funds are often managed they're not managed by the people who own them, typically. They're managed by somebody else. And there was a whole lot in 2008. I was writing about pension funds being sold the worst kind of toxic assets because they were chasing yield without realizing they were chasing risk.
Right. Well, in Michigan, it is the law that our our fund manager in Michigan for the pension fund for all the state employees, the former state employees, the retirees, well, and the ones who are still contributing, so to speak. 8%. That's what the state legislator said. 8%. We want you to get 8% every year.
They'll be lucky to get -8. That would be -8 would be a huge bonus. Those pensions don't exist anymore. Other than on paper, they're gone. So the financial industry, when they were selling toxic assets to pensions, they called it landfilling toxic waste. So they knew perfectly well that they were selling pension funds assets that would be worthless. And the same thing is happening again. Pension funds are chasing yield, but when you chase yield, you chase risk. And people say, but I need this kind of return. But what they're doing is they're going to lose the income and the capital. So this is going to be horrendous. These pension funds are drastically underfunded in the first place. And what they do have is not necessarily something that's going to hold any value. And the returns that are baked into the equations are wildly unrealistic. So pensions are toast, unfortunately. And this is absolutely part of the bubble.
Okay,
and this
Nicole.
comes as a shock to people.
I get a pension check of about 2,000 US every month. So how long until that check stops coming, Nicole?
I can't tell you how long until it stops coming, but it's going to stop coming. And so this is going to be a major, major problem for a lot of people. So this is a financial perfect storm. When you move into deflation, what you get is unemployment goes through the roof. Interest rates, which are currently really low, are going to go up. At some point, they're going to spike very, very much higher. People are going to find their negative equity, they lose their homes. The market crashes, they lose their investments. You know, they're losing other sources of income as well, quite likely. And they just get really caught. When unemployment is high, for instance, there's no bargaining power for people who are employed. If there are 100 people who would happily do your job tomorrow for half what you're being paid, then you're going to get a 50% pay cut.
So even these essential workers, you're saying, so the grocery store workers, for example, because that's fairly unskilled, right? I could be a grocery store worker, or I could drive my car if I put insurance back on it and deliver food. So you're saying those wages, even though these people are delivering to the rest of us that are at home, those wages could actually have downward pressure on them?
They're firing doctors. They're cutting doctors' salaries by 20%.
You know something? I was talking with a doctor friend of mine 2 days ago, and off camera, he told me that.
They are, because these for-profit healthcare groups, they are losing huge amounts of money. They are cutting the salaries of the most essential workers at the moment. So nobody will be spared from something like that.
Except the owners and the capitalists, right? I mean, the millionaires and the billionaires, it drives me nuts.
Well, they benefit.
Billionaires.
They benefit in the early stage, because people end up having to sell all their assets at distressed prices. People who still have liquidity will buy them up at pennies on the dollar, and inequality gets drastically worse to start with. But then they have to protect that wealth from the rest of the masses, which is the vast majority of people who are now really, really angry. And that's a whole lot harder than they think. So ultimately, it's not going to work out well for them. They'll end up on the wrong end of a pitchfork. So there are people moving to, I remember in 2008, a whole bunch of people were moving to Patagonia. I was thinking, well, do you speak Spanish? Do you really think the locals are going to appreciate you parachuting in there? What do you think is going to happen? Are they going to just serve you?
So are the Richie Riches, are the Richie Riches from the US, I'm sorry, the capitalists, the owners, I don't know what the most clear term is. The people who you're paying, the rest of us are paying for stuff. So those people,
rentiers, a lot of
rentiers. Okay, there we go. Rentiers. That's an older term. So the people that were paying mortgages and rents and whatever, are they going to end up in Australia and New Zealand and other English-speaking parts of the world? Have they already bought their bug-out farmsteads there?
Some of them absolutely have. There's actually quite an industry of bunker building at the moment for extremely rich people. But I just think this is so short-sighted. It's about cutting yourself off from everything on the grounds that you can't trust a single other human being, except maybe you perhaps trust the security guard at the gate, but maybe even that's not a good idea if you don't treat him very well. But this is the exact opposite of the way to survive in a period of upheaval. You don't isolate yourself from everybody else. You set up a community, you work with people, and you make your survival in other people's interests because you're a useful, helpful person. That's the way to survive these things, not to sort of elevate yourself above everybody else psychologically, which is where a lot of them are psychologically at the moment, and not to dig underneath the ground and hide away from everyone.
But
because
Nicole,
you can't put everything away.
These people, the rentiers, they are better people. They are smarter. And so they deserve to be special. They deserve to keep their riches. They deserve, because they are smarter.
I absolutely disagree, and I know you're being you're teasing me about that, but yeah, what they have that's an advantage over other people, well, they get a positive feedback loop. So if you have, more will be given. So it opens a whole lot of opportunities if you have resources or connections, because connections can become resources. So things get better and better and better, and the more you have, the more you get. So there's that. But the other advantage they have is because they have so much of a cushion of everything, they have a really long time horizon compared to other people. So they can look further out because they know they're not going to be, well, they think they're not going to be hungry or thirsty or penniless or cold. They don't have to worry about the things other people have to worry about, so they think. So they can take that much longer term view. And if you can take a calm, longer term view, on the whole, you're in a position to make better decisions. It's not just a function of intelligence. It's a function of whether you feel that you can actually see far enough into the future to be worth investing in something or taking certain actions. Ordinary people, especially people who are living paycheck to paycheck, there's no long-term view. It's, I got through this week. Oh, good. And when people are in
or I
that
got
kind
through
of
this day. I mean,
exactly.
the people who are living in the impoverished areas of India and Bangladesh and
absolutely
Pakistan and the Middle East and Africa,
yeah.
Can I have enough food to feed my family this afternoon?
Exactly. So for them, next week is the distant future. You don't worry about next week. And in the States, you mostly don't have to worry about day to day, but people do worry about week to week. And increasingly, they will also be worrying about day to day. You cannot plan for the long term. You're in such a state of crisis management under those circumstances that people do not make their best decisions, and they find it hard to come together and pool resources and do anything more constructive because people are running around like headless chickens. And so the psychological position is very different. And it's by no means a matter of intelligence, particularly. Sometimes it can be a matter of being prepared to work such a ridiculous number of hours a week that you can end up gaining more that way. Some people do generally earn a lot because they work really, really hard. So that is possible. But most of the people, the rentiers, the really, really wealthy people, are really just getting money because they already have money. And they can make these long-term decisions. And one of the decisions they've been making for the last several years, probably at least a decade, if not more, they were doing this in the last crisis and quite possibly the one before that, is to buy farms, buy a bunker. I mean, farmland, I wrote about this a few years ago. Farmland has held its price better than gold. Farmland is one of the number one assets to have invested in over the last while, but it's a total bubble. Everything is indebted. But here, for instance, we have the dairy industry, but the whole industry has been overbuilt on the basis of debt. Now the commodity prices have fallen. We could end up losing the entire dairy industry in a matter of a very few years, just because we'll get price discovery. The price of all these farms will crash. For the farms that are being farmed by ordinary people, not the ones by the really rich who probably are just sitting on the land anyway. But you know, you can end up completely repricing all those things, and people end up losing their farms. Then rich people come in and buy up the whole lot, and you end up with concentrated land management, and everyone's a tenant in their own country.
Well, we have to make sure not to allow that, though. I mean,
I really hope we manage not to allow it.
As in the, I mean, first of all, yes, you know, I am in a sort of privileged position as far as I don't have to, I'm retired technically, right? But my pension is going to run out. But, and I'm not in the same boat. I admit, I'm not in the same boat as the day-to-day folks. But in general, the people and not the rentiers need to say, no, that's, you don't get to buy it. And even if you pay for it, it's still not yours.
There could end up being a revolution over this. I would think it wouldn't happen early, because early, what we're going to see is the shock doctrine. I presume you remember all about that. So
well,
that's,
you know,
that's when you exploit a crisis for political gain to shove through all kinds of things that you wouldn't have been able to shove through under normal circumstances. But when people are in a state of total shock, you can push through all kinds of power grabs, which is exactly what the Trump administration is going to do. And so that can be a huge problem. So I think that's going to happen first. There's going to be a power grab. And so people are going to be dispossessed. But over time, when people have lost everything, they lose it. So they get angry, and then you have a revolution. But the revolution comes when people are really pissed and have very little left to lose. So we're not there yet. Initially, I think there'll be the power grab, but then there'll be the resistance to that. And I think if people grab too much, and they'll be greedy, then there will eventually be a revolution. And then probably you end up with something like communism.
Well, this reminds me of like was it called not the, I know I'm going to say this wrong, so you can just laugh at me. The Irish Spring, the Egyptian Spring, the Middle Eastern, you know, when
yes,
a few years ago when everybody was out and they had the Orange Revolution and this revolution and Occupy Wall Street and all these things. Is that coming back?
Oh, yes, but turbocharged. That was minor. That was really nothing. That was not violent. I mean, well, someplace, and people in Tunisia, it was a fellow in Tunisia who started off the Arab Spring by setting himself on fire and things. So violent, but only to himself. He was trying to make a point. But I think there's going to be an awful lot more actual violence. I mean, in the US, how long is it going to take before people are starting to starve because they can't get unemployment, and they're not getting their stimulus checks, and they're not allowed out of their house, and they don't have anything in there to eat? What on earth are they going to do?
Well, and that drives me nuts, because I mean, just seeing this article today where the groups that are going out to the capitals, they are being encouraged and connected and incited by the rentiers themselves.
Yes, exactly.
But they're not wrong that they are concerned that they still haven't received an unemployment check and they haven't still received their $1,200. They're not wrong about that, but they're being manipulated.
Yes.
At the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I have complete sympathy with people who just desperately have to work to earn something because their children are hungry. Absolutely. But when I see these protest signs and people say, I want a haircut because my roots are showing, then I have zero sympathy for people like that. You know? Or I just want to go out to sports. I feel like doing this and I don't care what happens to anybody else. That seems to be the attitude that an awful lot of these people have. So I have sympathy for some of the protesters and very little for others. That I have huge sympathy for the people at the bottom of the heap who have no choice in this. They are just caught between a rock and a hard place in every possible way. And they're just trying to do what they have to do to be able to stay alive and feed their kids. And, you know, I really have huge amounts of criticism for a government that doesn't understand that and has done essentially nothing to help people. And one of the things I was looking at the other day was,
well, it's like it's so difficult. Okay, so here I am. I'm going to play president. I'm president. I'm going to say, hey, guess what? Visa, MasterCard, Discover. Guess what? You're going to add, first of all, no more interest. Number two, you're going to increase people's credit limits by $500 a week. Bam. Now people can go buy food. Now people can go take care of what they need. Bam.
There's
same day. Bam.
There's so many things they could do. I mean, in Europe, they're doing vastly better with this. People are really genuinely getting the help. Companies are getting help to keep people on. So the government is helping to pay the wages so they don't have to fire people. There are so many things that can be done that the government in the United States is not doing really at all. It hasn't done hardly anything that's going to genuinely help the economy in any way. One of the things that I thought was particularly egregious, you know how Georgia is opening up? Well, I don't think those people are actually going to go back to work. Most people want to stay if they possibly can. They don't want to get sick. They think it should go on for longer, as long as they don't starve to death in the process. They're not necessarily going to go back to work, but they've been told their businesses are open, so they can't claim unemployment either. So that just puts them between a rock and a hard place. This is not about actually opening up the economy. It's about preventing people from getting on the unemployment rolls. So it's doubly cruel, because you're going to open up enough to have an enormous amount of virus spread, but then not open up to the point where people can genuinely start earning a living again, because they're not going to have customers. I mean, if you're a hairdresser, who's going to want to come into your establishment? You're not going to earn what you earned before, even if you're in theory open.
So I'm wondering who's making this. I mean, if it's the governor, for example, in Georgia, and I okay, whatever his name is, it doesn't really matter. But so is he looking at the state budget and saying, oh my gosh, the state, we're not going to be able to pay our workers or pay our pensions or anything come September. And so, and we certainly can't have people on the employment rolls because we don't really have that sort of savings. And so we need to get people out there. I mean, what's the thinking, or the whoever's making the decision, if there's anybody?
If memory serves, if they wanted to raise taxes, then they would have to amend the state constitution, because they've actually made it unconstitutional to raise taxes. So the state budget then has a much harder limit, a much harder self-imposed limit than it need have had. So yes, I mean, anything they spend on unemployment, coronavirus, or anything like that is money they don't have to spend on other things. So this is going to happen across the US, by the way, not just in Georgia by any means. The states can't print money. The federal government is not going to help the states or the municipalities. They have a hard limit on their budget. So whatever they're spending on dealing with the virus comes out of everything else. So I think Chris Cuomo was saying he was going to have to cut education by 50%, for instance. These people don't necessarily want to do that. I mean, Brian Kemp, I think he's a bit evil, so I think he's probably quite happy to see people suffer. But Andrew Cuomo, I don't think is in that category at all. I mean, he's just coming out and saying, you know, everything I'm spending on this that I can't get back from the federal government is money I do not have in the budget to spend on all the other things we normally spend on. And what this is a power grab by the Trump administration. It's to try and destroy competing power centers. So the governors are coming together, trying to organize things, trying to ignore the federal government. But Trump is up there basically saying, he's extorting them like he did with the Ukraine. You be nice to me. You'd maybe drop that case against me, that rape case against me in New York, and maybe I'll give your state some money. That's the sort of quid pro quo that he's coming up with this time. Or you didn't grovel enough. If you grovel a bit, publicly grovel, then maybe I'll give you some ventilators or some PPE or something like that. This sort of thing that's happening is there
really enough control in DC to deny half of the states, more than half of the states, to provide them with the money so that they can pay their employees and their pensioners?
As I understand it, they're not funding any of the states, specifically because they don't want to bail out state pension funds. They're saying, oh, the problems with the pension funds are purely on the states. If the states have underfunded their pension funds, it's their problem, and we're not going to bail them out.
But it's not like the sovereign governments, the central banks. It's not like the central banks have like this number that they can't go up above when they're doling out the money. I mean, that's where the money comes from, and as much can come from there as they choose to release.
And it always could have done, and it never did. So, I mean, there are so many things that it's, oh, well, we can't have this because how would we pay for that? And we can't have that. And all of a sudden, trillions of dollars out of nowhere to bail out banks. So this is going to start to foment unrest, among other things, because people are saying, wait a minute, you said we couldn't pay for Medicare for all. You said we couldn't pay for this sort of program or that program. We had to cut Meals on Wheels and cut or not give government people a pay raise because economic circumstances and all. This was before there were any economic concerns. He said every year he's been in power that, we can't raise public workers' salaries. They won't get a pay raise because of economic conditions. So he's saying we have an economic problem on one hand, so we won't give you any money. On the other hand, he's saying we have the best economy we've ever had in the history of the world. And people are starting to see these things and go, wait a minute, this just doesn't make any sense. These are the kind of things that breed unrest. When people really see the extent to which they're being fleeced. Yes, the government could bail out the states. They won't, because they don't want to.
So should I be moving to North Dakota, because North Dakota has their own public bank? The state of North Dakota, for any viewer who doesn't know, the state of North Dakota operates as the Bank of North Dakota. And so the state can basically say, hey, that freeway that we built, that freeway is worth $1 billion, which means that's our asset. And now we have $1 billion of cash, right? Just like a mortgage. And now we can spend that $1 billion of cash within North Dakota, right?
I really wish other states had done that. It's too late now to set that up. I mean, they might set it up in the future down the line when things stabilize a bit, but I can't see the states being able to do that right now in the heat of a crisis.
Well, isn't this the same as in the Eurozone? Because in the Eurozone, I mean, all those Eurozone countries, other than maybe Germany, have given up their sovereignty because they no longer control the ability to give credit, public credit, money to the public. And so they are exactly the same as a US state. There's nothing really, I mean, other than the laws are like distributed more locally, but it's the financial that's important, right?
Well, it's different in Europe than it is in the US. The US is much more of a transfer union than Europe ever was. So in Europe, you don't have anywhere near the integration. So if you looked at the US, was it 50% of Mississippi's budget every year comes from the federal government, for instance? That would never happen in Europe to a state. And states are much more separate. You don't have anything like the transfer payments that you would have in the US. So there isn't the degree of integration. It's going to be much more fissile. And personally, I think the European Union's days are really, really numbered. I can't see it surviving this at all. I can't see it getting through the next maybe even 5 years. You know, it depends. I mean, I'm not saying that's a forecast. I'm just saying I think it's profoundly unstable. The ECB is not going to be able to control the situation. And I think states are just going to decide to go their own way because they'll end up in such a crunch that they'll feel that they have to. So if they take back their monetary sovereignty, then people will be printing new drachmas and new lira and stuff like that, like there's no tomorrow. So things are, I think, somewhat different in Europe. It's not quite the same as in the States. I would love to see the States with public banks. I can't see them being able to establish it right now, but you're right. I mean, the Bank of North Dakota will act as a cushion, as a financial cushion. The problem North Dakota is going to have is that a whole lot of the oil industry that's there is going to be bankrupted. There are going to be ghost towns everywhere. I mean, North Dakota wasn't a phenomenally successful place before the oil industry descended on it for fracking. And so a lot of money has come into it. But when you have a lot of money come in, it wildly distorts prices and things in the area. And you end up with all kinds of problems. And then all the money leaves. And you've got all the problems that are left and no money to deal with it. The same thing happened in St. John's, Newfoundland, for instance, for exactly the same reason. It was a hub of the oil industry, the offshore oil industry. My brother lived there at the time. He watched house prices there go up by 300% in about 10 years. And Newfoundland is not a wealthy place. I mean, the house prices did not come down when all the oil money left, or not to the extent that they had gone up. So everything just got that much harder for people there. And I think it will in North Dakota too. So I think their public bank will take the edge off for them, but it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a great deal of hardship there too. I really think there will.
Now you mentioned a couple terms earlier that I want to circle back to. One was deflation, and another one was communism. And isn't it, Nicole, isn't it hyperinflation that we're concerned about? And if it isn't, I mean, because all this money's coming out, right? I mean, things are going to cost more. Like everything's going to cost more, or is it, am I looking, it's not everything, is it? It's just going to be certain things.
I see it really quite differently. Yes, they're printing a lot of money, but the extent of the credit destruction that's coming is going to so vastly outweigh that printing, they can't keep up.
Yeah, but they're
So,
doing trillions of
oh,
dollars.
they
Like if you take the Treasury plus the Fed, plus the other central banks, plus whoever else is pumping money into the, I don't know, International Monetary Fund or whatever, isn't that going to be more than enough?
no, I don't think there's the vaguest hope that they can bail this out anywhere near as quickly as credit is going to collapse. And remember, the derivatives market is $1 quadrillion. We're not talking about that level of printing yet. And that's only the derivatives market. And there's so many other things as well. The amount of debt is such a gargantuan multiple of global GDP that they're really past the point of no return. And credit destruction can happen virtually overnight. And governments just can't keep up with that with printing. Japan tried to print its way out of deflation for 25 years, and basically nothing worked. People just saved more, paid down debt whenever they possibly could, and so it didn't work. And Japan was the only one that went over the cliff at the time. That's why they didn't have some of the problems that everyone's going to have coming up, because they were an exporting powerhouse into the biggest consumer market the world had ever seen. So despite their domestic problems, they managed to make enough money from exports that they didn't have an absolute crash. There was a floor underneath it. But still, it was 25 years of stagnation and more even by now. But this time, everyone's going to go over the edge at once. And so what you're going to find is there isn't any kind of buffer. It's going to be the largest cycle that's going down this time. And anything you try and do further than that is not going to further below from that is not going to compensate for the enormous contraction from the top. So what you're looking at is an enormous deflation to start with, but governments will keep printing. They will keep printing as the deflation works its way through the system. At the point where the deflation has run its course, they will still keep printing because that's what they do by then. And then you'll have hyperinflation. And then you'll have complete destruction of fiat currencies. But for the time in between, and I can't tell you how long that gap is going to be, where we have deflation before we look at hyperinflation. There isn't really an indication of how long that would be. In the 1930s, we had a 10-year depression before things really started to take off again. Could be that, but because everything is collapsing so much more quickly, that could play out more quickly. But deflation and economic depression are mutually reinforcing. So the more you are in a depression, the more people are sort of pulling everything in and everything is contracting, which then furthers deflation. And then the more deflation you get, the more it causes a depression. So you get a downward spiral, if you like. So it really is when that's run its course that all those excess claims to underlying real wealth, I mean, some of them will just get massively extinguished in a deflation. But then if governments keep printing and create more of them, then eventually you will have hyperinflation and it'll be game over. You'll get the worst of both worlds.
Would it even matter at that point whether the central banks keep printing, because the people will have had accumulated all of this, and if they all decide, well at some point people are going to start going spending because they're going to realize, hey, I think prices are going to go up. I'm going to go fill up the pantry. I'm going to go get some stuff, and everybody's going to, and then the prices, I mean, if there's not price controls, I mean, at the point where price controls are no longer in place at the groceries, and you can only buy 2 gallons milk, whatever, is it really even necessary at that point for the central banks to be continuing to pump money in, or is it really a herd mentality that just pushes it over the edge?
Well, it's a combination of things. I actually don't expect prices to go up. I expect them to go down. But, and there's a big but, when things fall in a deflation, that doesn't mean they get more affordable. Because what happens is prices fall, but the amount of money people have falls faster. So even as prices come down, your purchasing power is falling faster than price. So things get less affordable even as prices fall. So for instance, as an example, just yesterday I was reading that jumbo mortgages are not going to be available anymore. So if you have a house that's, say, for the sake of argument, worth $500,000, no one who wants to buy your house can get a mortgage anymore. What's that going to do to the price? It's going to put a firm ceiling on the price of houses. It's going to push prices down. And the only reason mortgages, smaller mortgages, are still available the way they are is because they're government backed. But at some point they might not be. So what you end up with in a deflation is people can't get credit. Credit ceases to be available. And if you have to buy in cash, the amount that you can pay is going to be a whole lot less. If you can't borrow any money to top up what you have, there is no price support anywhere near current levels. So prices for homes end up absolutely falling off a cliff because the pool of buyers is this big. If the pool of buyers is people who have cash and who choose to use scarce cash for that purpose at that time, when they have a gazillion other opportunities to choose from, there's no price support and the market absolutely crashes. This is how you get your 90% collapse. But the same thing happens with all sorts of things. You don't have price support if people don't have purchasing power. So you can only sell for what the market will bear. For a while, there's a disconnect between what people are prepared to sell for and what anyone can afford to buy for. And then everything goes illiquid. So the economy has a seizure for a period of time. And you can't connect buyers and sellers or producers and consumers because there's not enough money in the system. The money is the lubricant in the engine of the economy. So you don't have the money supply. And what little money you do have, also the velocity of money has fallen because what little money you do have, you're probably not running out and spending because you don't know if your job is secure. Even if you haven't lost it already, you might lose it. You know you might, or you might know that there's a pay cut coming. You don't go out and spend under those circumstances. And if you're not spending, there's no price support. Almost everything falls into deflation, almost everything across the board, but not evenly, because some things are more essential than others. So if you have things that are essential and a much larger percentage of a much smaller money supply starts chasing them, that will give them relative price support. So you are going to get relative price support for food and fuel and the really, really essential kind of things. Other things will fall absolutely off a cliff and probably go to zero. If they're just things that are nice to have, they won't be worth anything. People won't be able to sell the things they don't need anymore because nobody else will need them either. So those things will basically have no value whatsoever. It'll be the things that are more essential that will retain monetary value. Their price won't fall as far, but it will likely still fall, at least initially. Now, if something is incredibly essential and becomes incredibly scarce, then yes, at that point, prices could go up even in a deflation. And then you will price a whole lot of people out of the market for something essential unless you have some kind of rationing system at the central level. And this is what they did, for instance, in England in the war. They had rationing. So there was a blockade, you couldn't bring things in. So the government took control of supplies and they issued ration books and they got everybody through. And in fact, everybody ate pretty darn well. They had a better diet and were healthier than the people who came after them, who then ate a whole lot of junk food. You know, people in the war did not eat junk food. They were really quite healthy. Now, I wouldn't want to trust the Trump administration with a whole lot of central power to start rationing things because I know perfectly well that it would not be rationed in a fair kind of way. Everything would go to the well-connected, and ordinary people or people he doesn't happen to like would get starved. So, I mean, if we need rationing, and I would argue you do, at some point, not now, but I think at some point you need rationing, then I would rather see it done at the state level in the US. Not that every governor is ideal either, but I think the governors, every one of them are better, well, maybe almost every one of them, are better than Trump himself. So I would far rather put that in the hands of the state governors to say, okay, we need to control this. We will issue food stamps, ration books, whatever it might be, because the alternative is to ration by price and starve the poor people. So those are the options. Either you control where everything goes and you give a little bit to everybody just because you are a human being, you get this, and you human being over there get the same. Or you just say, well, it's all here. Whoever first come, first served, whoever's got the most money will get it all, and everybody else gets nothing. And under those circumstances, I would really rather see increased central control. And I've lectured about this a number of times, that it's a double-edged sword. So there are times when you really want extra central control to ration and get through a crisis, but then when central controls have been granted, how often are they given back? That's the problem. You can lose your civil liberties really, really easily under circumstances like that.
Well, and so this is where I really feel in harmony with the people that are saying freedom is the number one thing. I mean, give me freedom or give me death is basically what they're saying. And
yes,
you're not going to take away my freedom, and you're not going to institute martial law, and you're not going to take away my house, and you're not going to take away the things that I've accumulated to take care of my family and whatnot. And so I feel that, I mean, I agree but in like different degrees. I mean, it's so situation specific.
It is. For instance, I trust our government. We have a complete lockdown. People are not protesting here. Not that everyone 100% is following it, but on the whole, people are. 88% of the population approves of the way this has been handled. And people on the whole don't think this is some power grab by the central government. This is something we're doing now. We're all in it together. This has been clearly explained to everybody. And I firmly believe that this government is not going to just hang on to those powers and screw people over. I absolutely would not say the same thing if I lived in the States or in England, for instance, or in Brazil, or a whole lot of other places. There are governments that you really, really would not want to give any central power to, and there are others that are trustworthy. Trust makes a huge difference to how this plays out, because people will go along with it perfectly happily if they trust the central authority, and then the powers will be given back, the civil liberties won't get destroyed. But if you have no trust, what you're going to get is power grabs from above and huge protests from below, and it's just going to be miserable for everybody. And I understand that these people really want freedom, but what they're asking for at this point is the freedom to die, or the freedom to make other people sick. That's the huge problem, because there's asymptomatic transmission with this disease. It's not a question of, oh, well, if you're sick, stay home and go out if you're not sick, because you can have this for a long period of time and be contagious before you ever have any idea that you're even ill. So if people go out and spread around all over the place, especially if they also refuse to wear masks, this will be as bad as if there had been no action taken to control this at all. So what you get is the worst of both worlds. You shut everything down, the economy falls off a cliff, the bubble is burst, then you open it up too soon, and within a couple of weeks, it will be as if you had never locked anything down in terms of viral spread. You've delayed it a little bit, but that's all. Everything will absolutely take off, and a whole lot of people will die unnecessarily. So all that bailout money then was bailout money for nothing, because you would end up with the exact same situation as if you'd never taken any action at all. Never locked anything down, never bailed anything out, just let it rip. If you lock down and release too soon, you end up with the exact same scenario with all the extra debt. So at this point, because the economic aspect is baked in the cake already, I think we need to keep the lockdowns going for long enough to genuinely start to get this under control again. Now, it's going to be so hard because it's so out of control in the States right now. So I don't even know how long a lockdown that would take. I mean, it may be completely unrealistic to lock down completely for the amount of time that one would ideally do on a public health ground, because the economy would completely crash. But this is where you have the hammer and the dance. So the hammer is the initial lockdown. And then when you've had that last long enough, but you can start to open up a bit again, you do it gradually. And if things start to get out of control, you shut it down again. Then you open up a bit again and you shut it down again. And you have this dance with the virus. So you don't have everything totally shut down for 18 months or whatever it might be, but you have things at a lower level. But you would have to have some kind of support from central governments, either federal, which will not happen for ordinary people, or state level, or maybe even municipal level. You would have to have some kind of support for people to allow for that to happen. Because otherwise, the only thing that's going to happen is eventually the whole thing will open up, it will rip through everywhere, and it appears to be extremely difficult to develop immunity to this. It's very difficult to develop immunity to coronaviruses in general. There are more mutations than people thought, it appears. That may mean there will never be a vaccine. There may never be herd immunity. So we're not looking at ever going back to where we were. If the dance has to continue for a lot longer than 18 months, then it will. But everything will be at a much, much lower level of economic activity at that point, which means the whole debt pyramid will have pancaked long since. And so we're looking at really drastic consequences. The idea of a V-shaped recovery is just ridiculous. We're looking at an L-shaped sort of system economically going forward for quite a long time, I would argue. So I don't know how long that will last, or how long it even can last. But I think we're going to see totalitarianism. I think we're going to see a power grab in a lot of places. And if they're places like the States or Brazil, or places that are led by autocrats, it's not going to be pleasant.
Well, I don't know if that makes me feel comforted.
Probably not.
So on a related note that popped into my head, with the you called out the UK in particular. Is there a possibility, and this sounds kind of far-fetched perhaps, that King Charles will be really the monarch in control again?
Well, the monarch isn't in control at all, and I
Well,
can't see.
I know, but he's there, right? He's there. The
Yeah.
Queen's there, and he has a sort of authority.
I'm not entirely sure he does. There are monarchists in Britain who love the monarchy as long as they don't actually do anything, as long as they're figureheads. But there are other people who just resent the idea of wealth through birth. And so I'm not convinced the monarchy comes out of this in its current form, to put it mildly. I mean, Britain, I think, Britain is the center of the financial Ponzi scheme, where you can infinitely rehypothecate your assets. So it's kind of the global center.
I thought the USA was the center of everything.
The UK is even more so.
How is that possible? The US.
It's been going longer. I mean, it's the Bank of England and the center, the mile, the square mile they call it. So the square mile is part of London. It's the actual part that is called the City of London, as opposed to the outer London boroughs. It's not actually part of the UK. It's owned by bankers. So it's sort of a little nest of bankers. I think even the Queen has to ask permission to go there. It's really, really different. And it's like that because it's been going for hundreds and hundreds of years, much longer than any other financial centers have really been operating. And you can literally infinitely rehypothecate your capital. You can say, I will use this bit of collateral as backing for however many loans I want. And you are legally allowed to use this one little bit of collateral to back an infinite number of loans. This is why you have excess claims to underlying real wealth and a massive crisis of under-collateralization, because there's nowhere near the amount of real wealth to back all these loans. It simply doesn't exist. So the loans are excess claims. You have this much underlying real wealth and this many debts outstanding on it.
Is this the secret center of power and authority in the entire globe then, like this little square mile?
It's certainly a major one. I mean, I think it probably is, but if it isn't absolutely the top, it's right up there. I mean, it really is a major center. And this is one of the reasons that Britain, after it lost its empire, didn't absolutely collapse. It had North Sea oil and gas, and the City of London, which was generating enormous Ponzi returns for the entirety of the bubble. If you look at what Britain was like in the 70s, it was the winter of discontent, the 3-day week, going cap in hand to the IMF, garbage piling up in the streets. That would have been the trajectory that Britain would have been on had it not discovered North Sea oil and gas and had an enormous bubble, speculative bubble centered in the City of London. So, but because it did have those things, it's now expanded grotesquely. It's desperately overpopulated, it's overbuilt, it's energy dependent when it's running out of energy. So Britain is going to be so monumentally screwed, it just isn't real. I mean, it's not funny what's going to happen in Britain. And I feel terribly sorry for them. They will not be able to feed the population that they have. And when the financial system has crashed, they won't be able to import things from other places either. So this is going to be a huge, huge problem for them.
So there are people associated with this square mile. Like, how do you characterize them as far as power and authority and the ability to impact the global economy, so to speak?
Well, we're talking about a nest of incredibly powerful global bankers. So they pretty much have the ultimate power. They control the money supply. So they own the central banks, these people. The central banks are private institutions. And so you have this banking cabal that's behind the scenes. You always do. At the height of a bubble, there is always a banking cabal. I wrote an essay years ago about the one of the biggest bubbles in history, which was basically the 1300s. So you had the real economy, you get about 4% return in the real economy. This is the people who work with their hands. I think. Then you would get about 10% if you were financing businesses and things like that. And then you would get 40% if you were the shadowy Venetians controlling the arbitrage between gold and silver and controlling the money supply.
Well, so that's so interesting because we were just 2 months ago in Venice. And that's where even the word quarantine came from, because people on that
40 days.
island, all the bankers, they didn't want to get sick, right? They didn't want to get sick. And so if you were coming in with your stuff, you had to remain in your boat for 40 days with all your stuff in the lagoon before you could come in. And that was the center of world financial power at that time, right?
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And it was because they controlled the money supply. But when the system crashed, when the bubble finally ended, you had the dark, you had well, not the dark ages, but a dark ages. You had a horrendous period. Barbara Tuchman wrote a brilliant book called The Disastrous 14th Century. So you had famines, you had the Black Death, you had the crash of every bank and market in all of Europe. You basically had an entire global, at the time anyway, the financial system as it was centered there, and it completely crashed. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at now. There is a banking cabal, and they are pulling a hell of a lot of strings, and the power to control the money supply is enormous. And one of the early Rothschilds, so the one who founded the dynasty, said, "Let me control a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." Because it's the power to control money that is the real power in the land. Everything else is on top of that, is more superficial than that. And I do think that that system has run at this point about as far as it can, like the Venetian system had in the 1300s. And I think that we're looking at that having a monumental contraction.
So now I was watching this video by this billionaire, Ray Dalio. Are you familiar with him?
I've heard the name.
And he has this very, very nicely put together 20-minute talk about how, oh, there's these cycles, and there's these cycles in the economy with recessions and growth. It's every 10 or 12 or 8 years or whatever. And then there's these super cycles, and the super cycles are like these 100-year cycles. And he says, we're just going into this 100-year super cycle.
We are.
And I'm wondering, maybe it's something even bigger than that.
Oh, it could be. These cycles are nested. They unfold at all degrees of trend simultaneously. So you've got the business cycle, and then you've got things that are larger than that, where you would have a much longer recession. But yes, when you have a much larger cycle that goes down, you go down a lot further. So one intermediate level of cycles is called the Kondratyev cycle, and they divide that into seasons. Or you can look at it as the fourth turning. So Kondratyev winter or the fourth turning are basically the same thing. It's the dynamic of how things cycle. That first they grow, then they stagnate, then they contract, and then they crash, and then something else takes their place. So I wrote an article about this, looking at how that works in both socioeconomic systems and in the natural world. So the system in the natural world is called panarchy. So Buzz Holling is one of the main writers in this, and he looks at how in an ecosystem, you have these very small local cycles nested within larger cycles, and larger cycles sort of at the scale of maybe a riverbank up to an entire rainforest and everything in between. And these cycles are moving, they're not all moving all up or all down at the same time. They're unfolding at their own pace. So if you have a small cycle that's crashing, but you have a larger cycle it's embedded within a larger cycle that's still on the way up, that crash is not going to be that bad. It's not going to take everything out. But if you have your smaller cycle that's going down and the larger cycle is going down at the same time, and maybe the one larger than that, that's when you get your real crash. So there is periodicity to these things. It's not even in terms of years, but that cycle plays out really regularly. The Kondratyev cycle, I would argue, is actually based on a human generation, more or less. So when something happens, people learn the lessons. They teach those lessons to their children who sort of get it, but then the grandchildren throw caution to the wind and do it all over again. So you have a cycle of about 70 years, and then you have the same kind of thing again. You have the same kind of credit crunch. You have smaller ones and bigger ones. That I would call an intermediate sized one. You can have much larger ones than that. So you get into Elliott wave cycle work in this, and it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating to look at what it is possible to predict with that. But you can have super cycles, grand super cycles, millennial cycles. It depends. I mean, I think ultimately we will have a very, very large contraction, but we may not have it all at once. So we might have a smaller scale contraction, and then it might take longer to get to the larger scale one. At this point, we don't necessarily know. But what we do know is a whole lot of things are going wrong at once, and we are going to see a whole lot of those cycles trend down all at the same time and reinforce each other. This is what gives you a depression, when you get multiple cycles at multiple degrees of trend, turning down at the same time and self-reinforcing. So that's what I think we're moving into now. And then at some point down the line, there'll be another spring and things will start to recover. But I don't think we're ever going to be back into the position that we're in now. We had a system at the top of the bubble where everything was just as efficient as possible, a finely tuned machine for moving goods and money around with no fat in the system, really. So it was incredibly brittle. And we're seeing the consequences of that. And I think it's going to collapse down to something simpler. So Joseph Tainter, for instance, writes about declining marginal degrees to complexity, marginal returns to complexity. So as you get more complex, complexity generates problems that require more complexity to solve, which then generates more complex problems, and so on. And you get to the point where you can no longer deal with the amount of complexity you would have to have. I mean, you put in more complexity and it actually makes things worse. You end up with an over-complex system. And then the system has to collapse down far enough to be able to get back into the positive in terms of returns to complexity. And this is what's happened to, say, the Roman Empire that became the Byzantine Empire. So this has happened many, many times in history. We need to look at these cycles. We need to know where we are in the cycle. I mean, the pandemic is a bit of a black swan. And it was perfectly predictable that there would be a pandemic at some point, but no one would know when or what it might be. So it was not possible to predict this was going to happen right now. And you just have to be prepared in general for the downswing of a cycle. And hopefully people are, because people have been talking about this for the last 10 years and saying, these are the things you need to do. This is what's coming. So prepare for it in advance. Otherwise, when it happens, it's going to hit you, and it could hit you really hard and really quickly. A lot of people think, well, I'll wait and see what happens, and I'll prepare when I see things to start to happen. But it's too late by then. And that's really what's happening now. And this is very unfortunate, but this is acting as a driver for the cycle.
Now, you mentioned earlier hyperinflation after deflation. And so what I'm wondering is, does that mean, I mean, in Germany, between World War I and World War II, there was also this inflation, and the marks or whatever at the time, the German marks, became so valueless that
the Weimar hyperinflation of 1923.
Right, that you could actually take, rather than going to buy some wood to warm your house, you could
burn the money.
Just take the money, yeah. And you got more energy out of the bills. Yeah. So does that, I mean, are you implying that this is going to happen? Is it possible that this happens on a global scale rather than a national scale? And if so, does that mean that there's going to be like either a whole new global currency on one possibility, or that there's going to be just like millions of local currencies or something like that?
Well, I mean, I do think we're going to have a huge problem with.
Now, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? I want to know.
Well, it's just really, really complicated. So there's so many parts to sort of tease out. I do think when we do get to the stage where we might see hyperinflation, I think it will not necessarily look the same everywhere, but I do think that level of fiat currency destruction is going to happen at some point. After the deflation has run its course, then I think we are going to see that kind of thing happen. Especially in Europe, it could happen even quicker, because I think the euro will go down. Everyone will end up with their own currencies again. And because they'll probably be cut off from the international borrowing mechanisms by then, all they can do is print, and I think they will. And I think those new currencies will not hold their value very well at all. I don't think there'll be hard currency in places like that for a long time. But I think it could definitely happen in other places too, where I think you're just going to destroy fiat currency because it's not backed by anything other than confidence. And when confidence disappears, that will not have any value anymore. So I would say cash has a lot of value in a deflation because it's just about the only thing that people will still accept in exchange for goods and services. There won't be an access to credit in the same way, or maybe at all. So it'll be whatever cash, or maybe precious metals, but mostly cash, that you would have is what you will be able to do. So there's going to be a huge upswing in the value of cash relative to goods and services during a period of deflation. But at some point during that deflation, you have to start turning your cash into hard goods. So the value of the price of hard goods comes down. Now your cash will go further because the value of cash has gone up. So you buy your hard goods, and then you get to the bottom. Now you're not in cash, you're in hard goods, and that's exactly where you want to be to ride out a hyperinflation. So you have cash for the deflation, then you have hard goods for the hyperinflation that likely follows. So at that point, you wouldn't want to have cash. Absolutely, it won't have any value at that point. But temporarily, it can have a lot of value, and it can be one of the only things that allows you to put your choices into practice during that few years of the deflationary spiral downwards. But I think we could end up with local currencies all over the place. Depends whether the central control is truly lost. I think ultimately it will be, but it won't be lost immediately. So I think at first, the central monetary powers, the banking cabal that we were talking about, they will insist on maintaining their money monopoly, and they will try and squash local currencies, especially if they're successful, and especially if you can pay taxes in them. So this is what happened in Virgil in Austria in 1932. But I think that power will eventually be broken, and then it will go down to a lower level. And I think we will, at that point, see an absolute plethora of local currencies. And some of them will work really well, and others will be scams. So one of the reasons that they brought in a central bank was in the States before the central banking era, there were a lot of currencies that rose and fell, and they were saying we need to protect people from unscrupulous lenders by having some kind of central authority to control it. But unfortunately, the central authority became the unscrupulous lender.
And
this
is back when they were like, what was it called? Like the wildcat banks in the US, where each town would have a bank, and the bank would have their own bills. And but eventually the bank is going to go bankrupt. I mean, every bank eventually goes bankrupt. So when that bank goes bankrupt, those bills are worth nothing.
Nothing.
Basically.
Yes. So that was why they brought in central banking, because they said that was too Wild West. There was too much risk, and they wanted to reduce the risk. And initially it did. But over the time, you have moral hazard, and that system unravels, and then that will also crash, and something else will have to take its place. And I think that's something else when we move down the line a few years, past the point where so first you have the central control being maintained and used to suppress everyone, but then that eventually breaks down, and then you are going to have a plethora of local currencies. You're going to have the same Wild West that you had in American history before central banking. And in some ways that'll be good, in some ways not. There'll be a lot of scams. There'll be a lot of people running off with setting up a bank and then running off with everything. But some will work really, really well. And it will be a bit of a crapshoot, and it will be hard to know where to put things, where to trust. The trust is going to be at a premium for a very long time. But if you find a smaller sales system that you can trust and be part of, then it can work extremely well, because it'll be working within the trust horizon. The problem comes when you're too big and you're working outside the trust horizon, and then you have no legitimacy and everyone just tries to tear you down.
Well, I think the benefit of this is not necessarily the benefit, but a lot of things that we've been discussing sound like a dystopian future to me. But I think that a utopian future, this is the way I think of it. So we're all connected right now via internet and phone and whatnot. And for example, you and you're in New Zealand, I'm in the States, and we're having a live conversation about these really important topics.
Yes.
When we trust one another, right? We trust one another to a certain extent. And so the circles of trust will be very, very different than they were in the past. So I'll have a circle of trust, which is my neighbors, but I'll also have a circle of trust which extends out to the people who I've really had good conversations with and who I trust, right? So,
provided the communication mechanisms don't fall, and they might. So you can't absolutely guarantee that will be sustainable. It depends, because one of the things governments do when you have unrest is they start to shut down means for people to get together and organize anything. Virtually I can imagine them shutting down all the social media and things like that and making it really, really difficult for people to communicate. I don't think it'll be impossible, but I think it'll be harder than it is now to maintain those kind of social relationships online that we currently do. So we can't guarantee they'll be there. They might be. It may depend on where you are. So some places it may be maintainable and other places not.
But this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity, though, because so many people in the world have cell phones, right? And
yes.
And cell phones have a radio range of 3 or 4 or 5 miles, right? So there could be a peer-to-peer, phone-to-phone network set up via an app or whatever, an operating system, so that every cell phone was connected to a couple other cell phones, and text, at least, text would still be able to be transmitted from my phone to your phone on the other side of the planet. Now, it might not be instantaneous, but I don't think that there is not the possibility. I think there's still a possibility of having a global network without having the current global infrastructure that we have now.
It does depend, because these phones don't last forever, and people have to have a fair amount of money to be able to replace them when they fail. And the way things are at the moment, I mean, you're basically given a phone with a contract to use it. If you can't afford a contract and you can't afford to buy the phone outright, these things can have problems down the line. If people can't afford internet access, if it's a question of, do I pay my internet bill or do I eat this week? The people are going to have to make decisions like that for a while. And I think that's going to break down some of these networks, because people won't have the capacity to connect with each other, or people who put out content might not be able to afford what it costs to put that out. And in an era of no net neutrality, you might have to pay for the privilege of your content reaching people, so and people may not be able to afford that.
So now you're talking about, well, if the current wired internet system is not working, and if the phone-to-phone system is not working, well, then there's two other possibilities, right? There's the little satellites, Starlink or whatever, that Musk is going to put up, and then there is a ham radio internet, which as long as you've got your
that would be resilient.
I mean, that exists, right? I mean,
that would be resilient. That's the kind of thing I would look to. So it's things like that that are lower tech that I think they don't depend on the same level of complexity. So I think they're far more likely to survive in a useful form. So yeah, I mean, ham radios, absolutely. Or dumb phones. Like, I don't think I'd go for smartphones, but you can text with a really basic phone. So there are ways that people are going to be able to connect with each other that are not necessarily going to disappear. But I think some of the things that we take for granted now are likely to disappear. I mean, on social media, you can organize things really quickly. Things can go viral. You can get thousands of people together in a day sometimes. If you don't have social media and you have to just text them, it's going to be slower, it's going to be harder. You won't necessarily be able to look at people and communicate face-to-face the way we do now and things. So I don't think it will necessarily be the same, but I don't think that connectedness goes away altogether. What I do think is a good idea is to try and turn those virtual connections into real life connections as much as possible. I mean, I know you in real life, for instance. We don't live in the same country, but I do know you. And so that sort of thing really helps, especially when it comes to trust. If you've known someone personally, then you know whether you can trust them. And that makes a big difference. Whereas if it's just some faceless person, you don't even know what they look like and they're just texting you, it's much harder to maintain that level of trust, particularly when lack of trust is expanding, basically. That trust is withering on the vine. It's getting harder and harder to overcome the initial hump of suspicion to know whether you ought to trust somebody or not. And so I think trust is going to be much, much less than it is now for a very long time. It will rebuild again. It has done multiple times before, but I think it will take quite a long time, because I mean, what people are going to see is the most enormous betrayal by the global elites, that the extent to which everything has been grabbed, commandeered, the best of everything, and we're basically being farmed. We have a human farming system. So they're farming us and creaming off our surpluses and things, and all the money is going up to the top. Very efficiently, because when you turbocharge capitalism, instead of a sort of this kind of thing, It happens much more quickly and much more efficiently, and it's on a global scale. Globalism allowed that dynamic to reach the global reach. So without even having to go and invade anybody's country, you could suck the surplus out of the people in that country through subsuming them into the financial system, which is basically grounded in Ponzi dynamics. So you ended up with a global scale Ponzi scheme in banking. And so this is going to affect people globally. There really is no question about that.
I want to go back to communism. And you mentioned that earlier, so I'm going to use that word temporarily. Family, a family like my family of 4 operates as a family. So, you know, we go and buy food and we eat it all together. We don't pay for it. And we share this household and we don't pay for it. I mean, I'm not asking my kids for rent. And I'm not asking, my wife's not asking me for rent or vice versa. And we have a family, and we have, I mean, it's not really a gift economy. It's more just of a family, right? And so that's our like absolute circle of trust. We depend upon each other. And I think that can expand. I mean, we have our parents, right? And our aunts and uncles who are, you know, maybe they don't see things the same way we do, but we are really high trusting with them. And then more generally, or more specifically, actually, our next door neighbors. So I particularly trust the neighbor in this direction. We've known them for a long time. And I trust the neighbor in that direction. I mean, I know that each of us has different beliefs and things, but I can see that we can make, for example, on the street that I live, there's maybe 10 households, 50 people altogether.
I remember it.
And we can have an organization where we try to make a living together, where we all have gardens, and some of us are like really gung-ho on it, and some of us are focusing on electricity or water or whatever it is. And that can happen a lot of places as long as there's some land or something, right? So, but I would never characterize that with any one particular word that I've seen anywhere on the Wikipedia or a dictionary anywhere. If the whole world isn't arranged in that way, and if we have neighborhoods connecting with their adjacent neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are connecting with their adjacent neighborhoods, and if that becomes kind of the way it is.
Well, the definition of communism is really from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, which works incredibly well at small scale, as you say, in a family, in a small community, up to about Dunbar's number, which is about 150 people. So it works really well as long as you know what everybody's needs and abilities are. If everybody knows what everybody else's needs and abilities are, then you can't be lazy, you can't be greedy without consequences.
So this reminds me of 2 things. Number 1, it reminds me of eco-villages and permaculture. And number 2, it reminds me of back 100,000 years, the size of human communities at that time, or 10,000 years ago, or prior to the, you know, European invasion of North America, whatever you want to call it, the Columbian incursion. So the bands and tribes, that's kind of the number you're talking about, the trust circle.
Oh yes, and you don't need money if you operate at that scale. You will have an economy which is just an exchange of goods and services with no need to exchange money. It'll be much more of a barter kind of system, and it'll work quite well. There's no reason it shouldn't. So it's not a bad idea to have a system like that, but the problem comes when you scale it up, because then you no longer know what people's abilities are. You no longer know what their needs are. And people's needs tend to become wants, and then bigger wants. And people sort of think, well, maybe I can be a free rider and other people can work, and I'll just kind of sort of skate along and take advantage of what they've produced. And things get badly out of hand. So if you try and scale it up to the size of a country, what you're going to get is a massive amount of corruption and favoritism, cronyism, all this sort of thing, like in the later days of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was in theory everybody being equal, but some animals are more equal than others, as George
Animal
Orwell
Farm.
said in Animal Farm. Definitely people should read Animal Farm, or for instance watch the 1952 cartoon version of it, which is extremely good at looking at how the most high-minded revolutions can go badly wrong, and you just end up with a different.
And would you also recommend 1984 and A
Oh
Brave New
yes.
World?
I haven't read A Brave New World, but I have read 1984, and yes, I would absolutely recommend that. From what I've heard of Brave New World, I would recommend that too, but because I haven't read it, I can only marginally recommend it. I would say it would be worth exploring, and I would say that to myself as well, because I haven't got around to doing it yet. But yeah, these sort of dystopian times, this is what we're looking at for the next while. It's not going to be forever. It's probably going to be for a long time. But I don't think it's going to be forever, because there are cycles in everything, and things will come back up again, not in the way that they are now, I don't think. We won't have the energy. We won't have the money. Nobody will be wanting to engage in huge credit expansions and speculations after a bubble has burst. What you do is you go back to plain vanilla finance at times like that. You go back to the simplest kind of things, because people realize that all this speculation is what caused the problem. They don't yet, but they will when it's actually really happened to them. And then they say, oh, we mustn't do that again. We'll throw out all these fancy things and we'll get back to basics. And then we'll do that for a while. We won't be anywhere near as wealthy, but we won't get ourselves in trouble either until people forget all the lessons and then do the same thing again. But they won't be able to do.
This reminds me of something
that the same level.
This reminds me of something that David Kurovich said this morning when I was talking with him. And he said that we need to extend we need to within ourselves think about where we're at mentally and emotionally, and we need to recognize the selfishness and the inward turningness of ourselves, and we need to do the opposite, which is hard. We need to extend a hand and to the neighbors, to the people that we know, and we need to help. We need to find ways to help them.
Oh, yeah.
And that is the challenge between what I see as the direction of altruism and the direction of selfishness. We need to choose as much as we can. I know we also have to be selfish. We have to feed ourselves. But to the extent that we can, we need to reach out, because really our survival and our ability to be happy and to get what we want in the future is based on the people around us. And we need to recognize that's where it is, and that's the direction to better days. And inward turning and isolation and survivalism is the direction in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. I mean, we are going to have to connect with people. And the greater the extent to which your survival is in other people's interests because you're useful and helpful, the longer you're likely to live. So yes, you need to reach out, because that is really where security comes from. It's not anything you can do yourself. This is why building a bunker and stuffing it with canned food is an extremely short-term solution. It's not really a solution at all. Whereas engaging with the community so that you have a much wider range of skills, and everyone can do a little bit of what they do and exchange it for what other people do, that's what gives you something big enough for people to be able to live reasonably comfortably, to thrive, if you like. And you can thrive without being at anything like the level of material prosperity that we currently have. So what we have now is artificial. It's not going to last, but that's not what makes people happy anyway. I mean, the community and working with other people is what makes people happy. It's that connectedness. So I do think there are positive aspects that will come out of this. I really do. But I think things will be very different in different places, because in some places it'll work really well and people will come together and everyone will benefit. In other places, they might go more Mad Max. It might depend on the resource base, the density of the population, where the trust horizon is at any given time, for instance. I mean, if you compare, say, how Cuba and North Korea fared after their oil supply was cut off. So Dale Allen Pfeiffer wrote a brilliant book called Eating Fossil Fuels about this some years ago. And in Cuba, they had all kinds of horizontal connections. So they managed to cope with much less energy. Everyone just permacultured the country, and they lost 20 pounds on average, but they didn't starve to death, and they coped. Whereas in North Korea, where there was no trust and everything was purely vertical, it was nobody was allowed to really associate. Everything went through the party. It was all top down. People starved en masse, and horrible things happened that need not have happened. So it depends where you are. It's a path dependency argument. It depends what your society. Sorry. Depends how your society functions before you get into trouble as to where you're going to go with it. So if you have these local connections and relationships of trust, then you will get through this a whole lot better than somewhere that's already all broken down, where people don't reach out to each other, they don't connect, they don't work together, they don't share resources or skills or anything like that. And I just think the world is going to be a very big place again. And it's going to be very different from one place to another. So your local reality becomes your total reality. And so one thing I would really suggest to people, get to know what your local reality actually is. What do you make there? What do you not make there? What do you really, really, really need? What are your essential functions? How are you planning to service those essential functions with what you will be able to find locally? And people might have to start being really creative about that. But these are the things you can do now. So I would say it's too late to try and sell your house and get out of debt, but it is not too late to start building community and to start connecting with people and trying to build that resilience. Or if you really feel where you are that it doesn't exist and never will, then you might be able to go somewhere else, but probably only if you don't own a house. So if you're renting, you might be able to go somewhere else reasonably easily. If you own, then you're probably stuck in place. And this is one of the things that I was lecturing about years ago, that look at where you are, decide whether this is where you want to be stuck, because you are going to be stuck there. So if you don't want to be stuck there, the time back then was the time to go and find somewhere where you would rather be stuck, if you really want to go the ownership route. But the alternative is to go the rental route and say, I just want to be flexible. I don't know where things are going to go well. I don't know where things are going to go badly. So I just want to be flexible to be able to deal with whatever the world has to throw at me. And if you're renting, you can be more flexible in that sort of way. So this was our decision, to sell a house, have no debt then, and be flexible. So we're currently living in a rental, but we're looking at maybe buying a piece of land, preferably some small sort of hobby farm type thing at some point. We don't know what we'll ever be able to afford. We just have no idea what's going to happen to property prices in different places and what will be possible and what will not. But in an ideal world, this is what we would really like to do, to be able to pick up a bit of property with no debt, hopefully, just be able to get something small enough, because it's better to live in a closet that's paid for than to live in something that's large that you had to borrow money for. And when borrowing money isn't even an option anyway, then you better be able to live with it, what you can genuinely afford. And we would just build our own very small thing. There's wood here, there's clay here, there's light earth building and things like that. So you can build something really, really cheap. If you're prepared to live in something that's reasonably small, there's a lot you can do, and you can really connect with people. But those connections, I think, are so important. And I think people really need to build those with families, extended families too. I think that could be really important, because extended families are how the rest of the world gets by without state support. So you have the grandparents looking after the kids while their adult children are bringing in income, and everybody has something to do. Nobody's retired. Nobody's too young. Well, hardly anyone's too young to pitch in. If you're about 3, you can probably set the table and things like that. There are things, everyone ends up with a role. And then they look after each other. They come together to put something together that's a lot stronger than anyone would be able to do on their own. These are things that people can genuinely do still. It does depend on the circumstances, but if the parents' generation has a large house, the kids have all gone, the house is too big for them, people can come back and they can all share the one place and then look after each other. Then the family isn't overextended. So that there are all sorts of ways that people can come together. And I do think that's really important. So you can create your own little tiny scale utopia within a dystopian larger scale system. I mean, it might be a little difficult to keep it going, but if you have the human connections, then it can be tremendously rewarding, even if you're living in relative poverty compared to what you were used to before. You could have a lot less material wealth, but you could be tremendously happy. And this is what I used to see in Ireland when I went there in the late 80s. I mean, it wasn't a wealthy place at all, People didn't have a lot of money to rub together, but they were the happiest people I'd ever seen because the family and community connections were so strong. And I thought it was an absolutely beautiful life that they were living. Then the bubble happened and the social contract got torn up. The property prices went haywire and it really wrecked things because then you had winners and losers and resentment and problems, and the whole country got fleeced by the bankers, and it all went really badly wrong. Okay.
So we just took a little break there to get a water drink. So if you're wondering why there's a gap in the timestamp, I had to check on my kids, and Nicole had to do a couple things. All right, Nicole. So this is the question I was going to ask at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Are we headed towards utopia? Are we headed towards dystopia? Are we headed back to where we were? Give me a probability on each, you know, and it should add up to 100%.
I would say there's zero probability we're going back to where we were. The bubble has burst, and that's baked in the cake at this point. There's no amount of printing or bailouts that's going to restore the supply chains the way that they were before and restore all the employment. So we're definitely moving into a much more difficult time. I think at the large scale, it's going to be pretty dystopian for quite a while because we're moving into an economic depression. There's the rise of fascism globally. There's going to be totalitarian control in a number of places. So what I think some governments will do is have a power grab, control the resources, and basically as long as you have the energy to project power at a distance, you can control a territory. So I think a variety of places will be totalitarian for a while. Doesn't mean that every single aspect of life would necessarily be controlled. I can't necessarily see something like the Chinese social credit system, for instance. That depends on so much complexity that I'm not sure systems like that will be maintainable. So I'm not sure the extent to which it would be high-tech, horribly oppressive totalitarianism.
I'm not sure what the Chinese social credit system is. What is that?
So in China, they monitor people constantly. So if you're sitting in class and you're looking bored, your teacher's going to get a message that this kid is looking bored, wake them up. And so you will get points for everything you do that the government approves of. You lose points for everything you do that they disapprove of. You can end up with travel bans, not being able to get jobs. They can control so much of people's lives. This is incredibly dystopian even right now, I think. It's absolutely Big Brother is watching you. I mean, George Orwell wouldn't even have really thought of something as comprehensive as that. In 1984, his surveillance system was not as comprehensive as what they have in China today. I'm not sure that will last because it depends on huge amounts of energy and complexity. So it may be something that can't be maintained. So I think we might go back to more older forms of totalitarian control, which means they wouldn't necessarily be able to control everything. So in your small bubble, you can still live a more or less, you know, a normal, well, it depends on how you define normal, not normal as in what we have now, but sort of more normal human life where you're doing the same things that people have done from time immemorial. You're finding food and you may be growing stuff and doing things around the house and making things, and that sort of thing should still be possible. And so you can have perhaps your little utopia within a larger dystopian system. But I do think in a lot of places there will be a lot more totalitarian control than there is now. And I think fascist theocracy is probably the future in the States, which is really not a nice thought at all.
Theocracy meaning?
Government by religion, like Iran.
So like Catholicism or Protestantism?
Well, Christianity anyway.
Okay, Christianity.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which part of that would come out on top.
Sure.
I think just about all the SCOTUS judges are conservative Catholics, for instance. There's a lot of control in conservative Catholicism. Bill Barr is a conservative Catholic, really hyper-conservative Catholic, for instance. And there are a lot of them, but there are also the evangelicals. But I think you already see a whole lot of things that look like the Christian Taliban. I mean, these people who are AK-47s or AR-15s and they're wrapped in the flag, and there are people who you really would not distinguish them from Al-Qaeda operatives, particularly because they have the same combination of nationalism and religion and willingness to sacrifice themselves for their cause and be martyred and things like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Does this point at the possibility that power is going to shift from the oligarchs and the rentier class to the religious leaders like the Pope of the Catholic Church?
I don't think religious leaders in that way. I think it'll be politicians who claim to be religious. So Machiavelli said that a prince should always appear to be pious, but shouldn't actually be pious because that would constrain his freedom of action. He should appear to be pious in order to gain the sort of support of the masses, which is exactly what Donald Trump is doing all the time. He's the least religious person on the face of the earth, just about, but he's got all these evangelicals thinking that he's the next Messiah. This is how you get fascist theocracy. You get a upwelling of people who are rejecting the system as it is because they've been screwed by it for so long that they get to the point where they just want to burn it down. They choose a charismatic leader and it becomes a kind of death cult, which is really what the MAGA thing is at this point, I think.
MAGA.
It's profoundly, make America great again. So all of that, they literally regard Donald Trump as some kind of second coming. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I follow what some of these evangelists are talking about just to sort of see what's around. And I'm absolutely appalled at the extent to which they regard him as almost the second coming. And when you put someone in that kind of position, they can do no wrong. So no matter what he does, they will love him just as much and they will support him. And when you have about 40% of the population that will support somebody no matter what, and will consider that person's enemies to not even have the right to live, then the seeds of fascist theocracy are sown. And I think that's where the US is going at the moment. And I think it's going to be very uncomfortable for people who don't fit with that, who don't fit the ideology or don't fit the religion or any of it. Perhaps they could be just outliers on all fronts. It's going to be hard to be someone who doesn't fit in to what the system will become. But of course, people will do that anyway. And in the States, at least there's a ton of space. So if you're far enough away from other people, you can probably live more or less outside of central control. I don't think central control will be absolute. Do you know what the expression beyond the pale means?
Not really.
So the pale was the area around Dublin that Britain controlled really well. And beyond the pale was like, here there be dragons. That was the area outside of effective central control. And the same thing in Afghanistan. The president of Afghanistan some years ago could really have been better described as the mayor of Kabul, because the rest of the country was controlled by warlords and foreign invaders and stuff. So it basically means beyond the area where central control will extend to. So if you're living in rural Idaho and you're armed to the teeth and so are all your neighbors, the federal government is probably not going to take you on. So you're not necessarily going to be under the thumb in all places, but some places will be a lot more under the thumb than others. And the more dependent you are, and the more sort of concentrated the center of population that you're in, the more likely you are to see central control. Because it's a lot easier to maintain central control over something physically small than where people are vulnerable and they need what you can give them. And then you have leverage over them. You can control them in that environment. It's much harder to control people who are self-sufficient, living in the middle of nowhere, and have their communities and things. And it's just too difficult to try and control huge geographical areas that are very sparsely populated. So I do think even within the country, it will look very different from place to place.
This makes me feel, and I've had this feeling for more than a month now, that we're in a race. We're in a race. Those of us who believe in altruism and who believe in family and who believe in helping neighbors and taking care of neighbors and relying and being relied upon by neighbors, versus those that are like in the opposite mind frame, that are more on the selfish side. And I think humans are on the altruistic side, but I can't deny that
some are.
Fascism has arose before. And without using any particular trigger words that YouTube might translate into English and be like, oh, we're gonna demonetize this video, or we're not gonna make it come up in search terms.
I see.
Do you see any parallels between now and historical events in the past, especially like 1930s in Europe?
Yes, and especially in Europe, because Europe is going to see the fall of a single currency, and there's already going to be there's already distrust. And for instance, Angela Merkel is despised in Greece and Italy, for instance. So the Greeks or the Italians would say to the Germans, well, this is all your fault. You set this up for your benefit. This whole single currency was just so that you could lend us money to buy goods that you were producing, so you would benefit and we'd be in debt. And you knew this, and it's all your fault. And the Germans might look at the Greeks or the Italians and say, well, it's all your fault because you're lazy and you don't pay taxes, and you have all these inefficient, complicated regulations, and people don't follow the rules, and it's all your fault. And there's an element of truth in both of those, but neither of them is remotely helpful. So people are going to sort of look at stereotypes of other countries and judge them by the stereotype, and remember that they didn't like each other so much not that long ago. So I think the future of Europe is Balkanization, unfortunately. I think it's going to break up.
Balkanization meaning?
So the Balkans are like Yugoslavia, where it was one bigger thing and it broke up into lots of smaller things. And this was in the Balkans. So that's what Balkanization would refer to. Or what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, where you unpicked all the intermingled ethnicities, all got unpicked and everybody moved into their own little bits. And it was quite violent. You had ethnic cleansing and things like that. I can see that happening in Europe again. And Europe is so intermingled. And it has such a long history of doing exactly this. I think in the States, there are huge cultural divides. There's a brilliant book I read years ago. It was written in the early 80s called The 9 Nations of North America by Joel Garreau. And it was looking at where the cultural fault lines were in the US and, well, North America in general. And looking at, say, the cultural fault lines didn't match the state lines at all. And he was suggesting that this is where the divisions will come. If the United States breaks up, which I think in the longer run it will, not soon, but I think in the longer run it actually will, because these cultural divides are just getting worse. I mean, the polarization is enormous. I can definitely see the US being several different places. And those cultural fault lines are the places that I would expect those divisions to happen in. And I mean, when he wrote this, he says, this is the kind of book that will probably be more true when you read it than it was when I wrote it. And it is absolutely true that it is more true now than when he wrote it, because he wrote it 30-something years ago. And there have been other people who've written things along the same lines. Somebody else thought there were 11 cultural regions. I can't remember who it was who had put that out. That was much more recent. But I think we're going to see profound differences culturally. And people will want to organize their area with people who they feel are similar to them. So in times when the trust horizon is collapsing, you get us versus them. And us becomes ever more tightly defined, and them becomes an ever more pejorative term. So people divide themselves up into smaller and smaller groups so they can get to some kind of homogeneity in whatever sense they want it to be homogeneous. But it can be difficult if you don't fit into that. You can end up having to go somewhere else where your face fits better for whatever reason. So I think people will probably end up migrating, not necessarily out of choice. I think they might be forced. So, I mean, if you're a liberal in a really deep red place and you don't want to be a Christian fundamentalist and you don't want to worship Donald Trump or whoever comes after him, then you might just find that leaving is your best bet. And if you're a hyper MAGA Trump cultist in the middle of a deep blue state, you probably won't be terribly comfortable there either. So I think people are going to move voluntarily, and other times people will simply be forced in the way that they were in Europe after the fall of Yugoslavia, for instance. And I think it's going to be messy. And it will make things difficult for people who tried to own something and invest in it and put a lot of time in it, because then you're tied to one place. If that place doesn't work out, then your choice is either to stay there even if it's not working, or to go somewhere else, but then you end up leaving everything behind. So this can be hard on people. This is one reason that I would always suggest if you're going to be stuck somewhere, be really, really sure that you're stuck where you want to be, in a place that's, at least as far as you can tell at this point, that will work for you, and where you won't be forced to leave, and get yourself stuck there. Whereas if you're in the wrong place and you get stuck, it could be really uncomfortable, and you might end up being forced out and have to just leave everything you have behind. And that would be very unfortunate.
So again, going back to the 1930s in Europe, there was a number of things that happened over many years prior to the 1930s that ended up pointing things toward fascism. And do you see, I mean, what sort of parallels are you seeing that maybe I'm not observing?
Well, for instance, Hungary's leader just declared himself a dictator. Trump is talking about suspending Congress if he can't get his nominees through. But the thing is, he hasn't even nominated people for most of these positions. He's just trying to paint everything as the fault of the opposition by saying, the opposition is not letting my nominees through, so we'll have to suspend Congress. It's a complete lie. It's a fabrication, but it serves his purpose, because everything that comes out of his mouth is a self-serving fabrication, and most of them are projections. So whatever he's criticizing other people of doing is what he's doing himself, pretty much. It's fascinating to read people psychologically. When you see how their mind works, then you can tell what they're thinking from what they say. You don't take what they say at face value, but you can look at what they say, and it tells you really important things about their inner mental functioning that they wouldn't necessarily want you to know. It's very interesting to watch these sorts of things. But yes, there's the rise of authoritarianism all over the place. I think Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, Xi in China, Orban in Hungary. It really is spreading. Poland is going that way too. And Eastern Europe has often been fascist. So it was communist for a while, but it's going back to fascism, which is more its kind of natural state, I think, or historically speaking anyway. No, I think there are going to be a lot of problems like that. There's not enough to really go around at the level that everybody wants, where there isn't enough to provide the slice of pie that everyone thinks they are entitled to, then people will fight over slices of pie. And you get the rise of strongmen, unfortunately. And often they're people who promise their followers, everything will be all right, we just have to go and kick those people over there. It might be those brown people, might be those liberal people, might be those female people, whatever it might be, whichever group you don't like, you pick a scapegoat and you tell people that all the problems they're facing are the fault of this group of people, and if we just go and abuse these people, then somehow that will make things better. And this is what tends to happen in fascism. It's very much a divide and rule. And sometimes people really fall for it. You get leaders who are charismatic in one way or another. I mean, I wouldn't consider Donald Trump a charismatic person, not to me anyway, but clearly to some people, they find that he really does draw them in and he's promising them the earth. He can't deliver what he's promising. He hasn't delivered on anything he's promised. And it's not even physically possible to deliver on these promises. But people believe it anyway because they're so desperate to believe in something. The existing system has screwed them for years and years and years. I mean, the rural America has just been bled dry for the longest time. And so they don't want to go back to the way things were. They specifically elected someone who they knew would burn it all down and would hurt the people that they think have been the winners up to now. That was really the dynamic. He was elected not in spite of his personality flaws, but because of them. That was what appealed to a whole lot of the people who actually voted for him. And they would do it again. And some of them would do it with even greater fervor now than they did back then, because he's become more and more of a quasi-messianic kind of figure to these people. So that's charismatic in its own sense. Someone who uses force of personality to draw in a group of supporters who will then suspend rational thought and commit themselves just completely. Say, I completely trust this person. I won't question anything they say. It's like religious fundamentalism of all kinds. You don't question things in religious fundamentalism. You accept what you're told from on high. And the people on high, of course, tell you that it came from even higher. So they would say it's not coming from a human agent at all. It's coming from a higher power. So then you have to obey the higher power. And people are far more inclined to obey a higher power than they are to obey a human being, however powerful that human being may be. So once you start to get a strong man who's backed by religion and the religious fervor that comes with it, that's when you have a truly dangerous situation. And that's very much what you have in the States at the moment. I wouldn't say that was true in Hungary, for instance. I mean, it's a dictatorship now, but it's not a religious-based one. And so things can look different in different places. Where you truly get charismatic leaders leading what it becomes a religious revival, that is the most dangerous kind of situation. Same thing happened in Spain when they fell from their peak, and that's when you ended up with the Inquisition and things like that, where you had better conform to the beliefs of the majority or horrible things will happen. It's a bit like the Salem witch trials, but on a much grander scale. So if you don't conform, anyone can accuse you of something, and you can't necessarily prove that you're innocent. And so you can solve all kind of petty scores that way just by accusing someone of something. And now it gets very messy, unfortunately, when things like that happen. And it has happened so many times in human history, in different places at different times.
This makes me think of, again, this race, that I think we're in a race. I feel like I'm in a race. Like every day I feel like I'm in a race to try to spread this idea of, if we work together, as we work together, as we reach out to one another, as we connect with one another, as we make peer-to-peer interactions and relationships and economic exchanges and agreements and trust, we expand our trust horizon, that we are in a race against this thing that you were just describing. Yes. And that we can get there, we can get to a better place. It doesn't have to be these isolated little, I mean, there'll still be these isolated utopias. We're not necessarily going to be traveling from one coast to the other anytime soon. But even on the more macro scale, it doesn't have to be like that. And some of the things, well, I've got two angles that I want to explore with you. One is the founding of the United States, and the other is the places where I kind of see hope, especially worker co-ops, the Mondragon Corporation co-op,
oh, yes.
co-op of the Basque region, which is a co-op of co-ops. It's a co-op
Absolutely.
of co-ops of co-ops, really.
And it's been brilliant.
And the Rojava region of eastern Syria, where the Rojava people, the men have mostly been killed in conflict, and so it's primarily the women who are doing like this it's not nested, but it's like this network of networks, and each city has its councils and the councils of councils, and then they come together councils, and they all have. But first, I think less interesting actually is the founding of the U.S. and the fact that the U.S. didn't create a national currency, and there was this struggle between those that wanted to have a national dollar and those that thought, oh, that should be a private dollar or a private banks or whatever, and what this might inform us of the future. And this comes up because, of course, Hamilton is this very popular play right now, and lots of people have seen it in person, and then even more have seen it bootlegged on the internet. And you know, Hamilton and Jefferson and Franklin and all the founders who were around at that time. And I know my actual understanding of this, I was not there, so I do not really know what really happened, and I don't know if anyone could. I know there's a lot more information that I miss and I forget about. But looking forward, what mistakes were made then that got us to where we are now?
I don't think they anticipated the extent to which you would not only have a criminal president, but you would also have that person enabled by just about every other aspect of government. So they built in mechanisms for removing presidents. And Trump has been accused and has been demonstrated that he did in fact commit bribery, which is exactly what is in the Constitution as an example for why you would want to impeach somebody. So he's definitely committed an multiple impeachable offenses. But what was not anticipated was that an entire party would vote not to impeach to enable someone who is demonstrably criminal to stay in power. And that person would also be able to corrupt the court system and now the intelligence communities and things like that. So the process has been to subsume all the institutions into under the control of the executive branch, which is exactly what the Constitution was designed to avoid. It was supposed to be checks and balances between the executive, the judiciary, the legislature, and there wasn't supposed to be anyone with dictatorial power. And there were supposed to be mechanisms for dealing with anyone who got too big for their boots and to remove them from power. But they did not anticipate someone coming to power who was able to commit offenses with impunity and being able by half the country or half the mechanism of government at the time. So being supported in impeachment by an entire party, minus one. But I mean, the Supreme Court is now very right-leaning. There have been an enormous number of conservative judges. A lot of them are not even qualified, and they're very young. So there's been a complete change of the face of the judiciary. And this is going to have consequences for decades, unless the whole system is just broken up and disappears entirely, but I don't think that's the case. So what you have at the moment is the institutional framework has come under the control of the executive. And people didn't realize the extent to which a lot of things weren't based on written laws or things explicitly in the Constitution, but were norms grounded in human decency and expectations that people would follow the rule of law. So as in England, which doesn't even have a written constitution, there were a lot of things in America that were still based on norms and conventions, and this is just the way we do things because this is the way we've always done things. And people respected that for a long time. But then you have someone who comes along who refuses to follow any norms, guidelines, and even laws, just basically says, no, I'm above the law, explicitly says, my authority is absolute. That's what he said the other day. So in other words, he's saying he's king. This is incredibly dangerous because it's completely destroyed what the Constitution tried to set up. And I'm not convinced that there's any way back from that, because once those norms have been broken, that's precedent. And anyone else who comes along will say, oh, well, this has obviously been allowed before, so I'm going to do the same thing.
So are you saying if by some unexpected chance that the current president was not reelected and the opponent was elected, that things might go the same way anyway?
I'm not convinced right away. I think if there was if they have a blue wave, if there's a complete democratic sweep, then I think what you'd see is people desperately trying to manage a bad situation, because we'll still be in the middle of the pandemic and well into an economic depression. People will be desperately trying to manage that situation. And even if they do the best job humanly possible, which is asking an awful lot of any politician, it's not going to look like success to ordinary people because it's not going to get them back to what they had before. So whoever takes power is going to be regarded as an abject failure.
Well, and the current president under the US Constitution would still be able to run again.
Well, yes, you can run again. I'm not sure there's going to be an election to start with. And even if there is, I'm not 100% convinced that he'll be running in it because he's deteriorating so quickly, cognitively, neurologically, and he's going so far into overreach.
We're talking about the presumed opponent, right?
Well, so I was talking about Trump himself. So I think he'll probably cancel the election. He's certainly not in a position to debate anyone. I don't think he has the stamina to do what it takes to really run for re-election anyway. I mean, they might prop him up for as long as they possibly can, and because it's getting a bit late for them to put anyone else in. I'm not sure, though, what's going to happen with social mood, because when you really move into a depression, often people turn on the leadership, no matter what the leadership is. So it is possible that if there is an election that is fair, I don't think it will be fair, I think they've already rigged it, but if there was a fair election, I think the odds are at this point that he would lose. I think there'll probably, my best guess at the moment is there'll be a very unfair election. My next best guess is there'll be no election at all. I certainly don't expect a free and fair one. So he could come back again, in which case the power consolidation would be complete. at that point, and you would have had a right-wing coup in the States. It would be a right-wing fascist coup. So the US will become a fascist theocracy over the second term. I think there would be no coming back from that at that point. If there is an election and the opposition wins, it's a poison chalice, because they will end up being blamed for things that are not their fault, just because they cannot give people back what people had. And I also think there wouldn't be the cooperation of the moneyed interests with a group of people who said, we want to bail out the ordinary people rather than the banks. The powers that be that pull the financial strings probably wouldn't allow that to happen and would undermine them at every step. Democratic presidents often get undermined. I mean, when Obama was president, the Senate under McConnell was just blocking everything he tried to do. So they wouldn't pass anything, and he ended up doing things through executive order, and then they told him that was executive overreach. But it was because they refused point blank to let him pass his agenda. And anything he did get passed was so watered down that it wasn't what he would have wanted. It was the only thing he could get, because he was being undermined constantly, and the monetary interests were opposing everything he tried to do. I think that would happen again. So I think, unfortunately, if the Democrats do win, I'm not convinced that they won't just get booted out of power. Argentina went through multiple presidents in a matter of months because nobody could fix it. They would put a new person in and say, you fix it then. And then he couldn't fix it, and he was out and the next person came in. So I think you could actually have a huge amount of upheaval. I think over time, both political parties will be destroyed and other things will come up in their place. The Republican Party is already now the party of Trump. It's not Republican anymore. All the real Republicans with integrity, and there are quite a few of them, a lot of the never Trumper people are really interesting to listen to. They're the first ones to say, my party is dead. It no longer represents me. I cannot be part of it any longer. So there's going to end up being a group of people that come together from that, who are going to want to form their own forms of political representation. I think the Democrats are likely to implode as well. You've got two factions, and they don't necessarily sit well in the same party. And you've got people who really want to do more for ordinary people. You have others who are really corporate and centrist. And I don't think those will ultimately sit well in the same political party. So I think you're likely to have political fragmentation in a lot of ways. And you might get leaders even crazier than Trump. I mean, as Jim Kunstler said, people elect political freaks in times of contraction, because everybody's looking for someone who can solve their problems. And people who are populists, really extreme populists, will tell you whatever lies they have to tell you to get you to believe in them. They're snake oil salesmen. But desperate people often turn to a snake oil salesman just because they prefer a comforting lie to the truth. You know, if you're Jimmy Carter and you say, put a sweater on, you can't compete with Ronald Reagan saying it's morning in America when it comes to grabbing hearts and minds. I mean, there's no question which people would prefer to be told. And that will continue to be true. People will cling to straws, even if partly they know it's not real, it's not going to happen. They just get so desperate that they will reach out for that anyway. And then the consequences are that gets inflicted on everybody else who didn't necessarily want it. But I think it's going to be just a mess politically for a long time. But I think there's been enough movement in the direction of a right-wing consolidation of power that's the kind of totalitarianism I'm expecting in the first phase. And I think that will eventually break down. All totalitarianisms do. I don't know how long it would take, but because of the degree of upheaval that's coming, it might be a lot quicker than it has been in the past. So they might be thrown out too. I mean, there might just be a complete disintegration of power structures at the national level over time, not instantly, but over enough time. I can imagine that whole national bureaucracy basically just being so dysfunctional that it can't really achieve anything, and eventually it just disappears. And then you move down to a smaller scale. And it's really only the smaller scale things that will have a chance of being within the trust horizon anyway. So you would expect things to go down to a much smaller scale. Effective organizational scale will be very small for a long time. The kind of things that you're doing with your neighbors, which is brilliant, more power to you. That's exactly what you should be doing. And whether or not it'll ever lead to any kind of more widespread utopian kind of system. I rather doubt that, but that doesn't make it not worth doing. It's absolutely worth doing. In fact, it's the only thing that's really worth doing is following this kind of path to try and build things up. You'll be facing a hell of a headwind, but you need to do it anyway. And this is, we really need to have the courage to do these things even if they're hard, and they will be, but that just makes them even more important. And you might be able to spread it over wider areas and set up communication networks that don't necessarily depend on the social media that we currently have. And you might well be able to make that work. It helps if you can also keep it under the radar a bit. Like, don't have it be too widely known how successful you are, because otherwise it attracts the wrong kind of people who do not wish you to be successful, because any form of decentralization is a threat to the centralizing system. The system that sends wealth upwards doesn't like it when wealth tries to come back down. And decentralization is all about putting the wealth flow into reverse. This is a threat. It will be opposed. But if everybody is doing it, they can't prevent everyone. At some point, people will just say, I don't care what the rules are. This is what I have to do, and I'm just going to do it. And if everybody is doing exactly that, then there are too many people, too many initiatives to squash them all. So we need to have everybody moving in that kind of direction. So the analogy I like to use for this is, so in the Serengeti, you have the plains, the Great Plains, and the herds move across the Great Plains every year. They migrate. They have to get through great big rivers with 20-foot crocodiles in them. And you really, really don't want to be the first wildebeest in the water, because all the crocodiles are just waiting. But when the entire herd is crossing, most of them will get to the other side. The crocodiles can't get them all. They will get some of them, but you will get most of that herd across to the other side just because the sheer volume of numbers. So if you have a system where everybody is trying to live in a different way, or at least a critical mass of them, then you really can make a difference, because it isn't possible to prevent all of it. The more remote you are and the more under the radar you are, the easier it is to keep going long enough to be truly successful. So it is always going to be a bit of a balancing act, and some things will get shut down by central authority, but not everything. And even if some of them are going to get shut down, it's still the right thing to do. You just need to be one of the people who's adding to the critical mass of people doing the same thing, hoping to get to a different way of being at the end of the day. And we can be developing ideas as to how things might be run. Because one of the things that happens in a contraction, when people are starting to rebuild, you get past the phase where everything's falling apart, and you start to think, how would we rebuild? Whatever ideas are lying around are the ideas that people might pick up and run with. Don't let it be the fascists that have all the ideas lying around. If other people with much nicer views of the world have developed ideas that can be put into practice, where they can demonstrate pilot projects, basically this worked at small scale, so let's try and spread the ideas, that can go viral. So this is the sort of thing that you really need to, you put the effort in and you really can build it up. But it's positive feedback. So it starts slowly. It takes a long time to sort of build up and get momentum, but when you hit critical mass, things can take off. And I think if the right ideas are lying around when the contraction is over, you could end up seeing something that is a lot nicer, at least in places. I still think there's going to be a period of totalitarianism that will be really unpleasant, because the larger scales of government don't want to just disappear. They have power. They don't want to just surrender that. They want to keep it if they can. So they'll try and control the resources in order to maintain the power, but eventually they just won't be able to do it. And at that point, all the smaller scale things can flourish. It's a bit like once the dinosaurs are extinct, the mammals have their day. So you don't necessarily want to build a better dinosaur to redesign the existing system, tinker with it a little bit. Building a better dinosaur is not the way to go. Be a mammal and be the next stage in evolution.
This makes me think of a lot of things.
Good. I like that. You make me think of a lot of things too.
Well, I mean, going back to what I mentioned before, the workers' co-ops, which are the opposite of capitalism. Well, and not just a workers' co-op, but I mean a family co-op. So this family is part of the co-op with all these families, and we're all a co-op, and we try to pull in, enough people that we're able to basically serve as if we're our independent community to a certain extent. But we need a doctor. You know, like I know a doctor who's 3 miles from here, and we communicate a little bit. And you know, we need a few. We need you know, people that are good at community building, and we need people that are good at growing food and storing food and making sure the waters and the electricities. But so workers co-ops like that, and then the Mondragon Corporation in the Basque region, which apparently it's independent from the national government of Spain to a great extent, and the only extent that it is not independent is the point where it's required that the individuals pay whatever taxes that the federal government and the European government demand. And then again, back to the region, the Rojava region, and I might be pronouncing that not quite right, of Eastern Syria, where the men have died. And so again, this is like more of a fractal sort of organization where each individual is like the far out branch, or like in the lungs, where each one of them is a air sac, or whatever you call them. And,
alveoli.
Oh, alveoli. And that these are systems on systems on systems. So even when you have this number of 150 or whatever, I don't remember what you called that number.
Dunbar's number.
But now you can have 150 of those 150s, and then you can have 150 of those 150s, and it can be distributed and relocalized, whatever happy term you want to use. In that way.
I don't think it'll scale up terribly well, because I think there will be strong men who come along and disrupt it if it gets to be too big. I think it's more likely to work at smaller scale. It's hard to say. I don't think we're going to end up with a global network of independent villages. I cannot see that happening. It's not the way history has ever played out before.
That doesn't mean, use your logic, Nicole, that doesn't not mean it's not possible.
But the thing is, what we have now is a planet that is vastly over carrying capacity. So we have 7.5 billion people on a planet that, for the sake of argument, maybe has a carrying capacity of about 1 billion. We are going to be experiencing a contraction that's going to get a lot of people very angry with each other. I think there's going to be conflict on a large scale. I think we're going to come out of the end of the century a lot closer to carrying capacity than we currently are, and getting there is not going to be pleasant. So I think under those circumstances, being able to scale up a network of villages is not so realistic. But at the end of the contraction, and I do think this entire contraction, the bursting of this bubble and reaching any kind of lasting bottom, could be decades away. It could be nearly the end of the century before we really start to come out of this. But at the point where we do, and you and I won't see it, but that sort of thing can take off and be rebuilt. But it'll be rebuilt at a much smaller scale, because there'll be a lot less people and a lot less complexity and a lot less dependence on resources and technology and things like that. So I think that can happen, and it's very much worth trying to sow the seeds of it early, but I don't think it's going to take off until we get back down to a more manageable scale. Because when things work at human scale, people can learn from their mistakes. You get feedback. So a system that works at a human scale will do something. If that doesn't work, oh, well, we won't do that again. Large scale systems reach a kind of functional stupidity, to use Dmitry Orlov's phrase, where they reach a scale that cuts off, where the feedback is then cut off. So they become internally self-serving. So the decisions they make are functional in that they keep the bureaucracy or the large scale entity going, but stupid in that they sow the seeds of its own destruction. And when you cut off the feedback, you have no ability to learn from your mistakes. At that point, you're locked into a trajectory. You're unreformable. So you will proceed until you hit a brick wall and then collapse and something else takes its place. So that's very much the kind of thing that I'm thinking we're looking at.
I'm wondering if one of the concepts that I mentioned to David earlier, and last week actually when I talked to him, was this idea that there's a natural evolution on any planet that has life, and it starts on the pre-cellular level to the cellular level to the cellular level with complexity and mitochondria and whatnot, to the cellular level, all the way to where we are now.
And you get emergent properties at each step up in complexity. You get emergent properties of scale.
Right.
Civilization is the latest one.
Well, and that there is this thing that occurs where eventually organisms, the most successful organisms will end up being organized, evolve to be organized into superorganisms. For example, with the leafcutter ants, where you have the leafcutter ants that they are a single entity. Each leafcutter ant community is as if it's its own organism, where each ant is a cell within the organism, the superorganism.
Bee colonies as well. Insects are very good at this.
And so
yes, that's exactly what happens. And we've done that. We went from tribes to villages to towns to cities to nations. And now we've been trying to organize at a global level since the 80s. So this is what globalization was all about, sort of subsume it all into sort of one structure that controls money flows and things and goods flows all over the world. And that's exactly what we've done. Energy allows you to do that, to move from one level of organization to the next, to the next, to the next. But then when you reach a limit in terms of energy, the way that tends to manifest is you crash the financial system, because that's the most virtual and the most fragile, but it's actually an energy issue. We're going to end up having a lot less energy than we have. We won't be able to maintain our current level of complexity. So all those layers of emergent properties, you're going to knock them off one by one and go back down to something much, much smaller.
Well,
and then
what I was going to say,
rebuild, we can get bigger again.
What I was going to say, to extend this thought, is that there's a common enough idea that's on the internet that is that each planet that achieves this level of complexity with a complex civilization and a global economy gets to a point where it actually moves to the point where the intelligent species, the conscious species, the language using species on that planet becomes a superorganism, a consciousness, and a mind for the planet itself. And the term used for this is the world brain, the global brain. It's called the moment at which it becomes conscious and globally connected and all pulling in the same direction, like at some point the ant mounds and the bees must have done, which would have been during a stressor, right? Because it would have been a stressor that would have been bad weather or a drought or whatever, that it becomes this whole world organism, like a superorganism that's all the most of like basically everything that lives on the earth. So it's like a Gaia hypothesis or a earth conscious hypothesis, and at that point each planet becomes its own entity that's intelligent in itself. And some people refer to this as like the singularity, which
yes, that's what I've heard it called.
Right, and it's the combination of the ability of us to communicate with each other almost instantly, just like the cells within our brains. And it also is the memory capacity that is shared amongst all of us, which again here is in our brains is stored, I mean statically, the memory is stored by the actual patterns that have grown within our brains. But by the same token, in the global economy, it's held by the networks of communication and the storage mechanisms, like all the internet storage that there is, the Wikipedia and everything else. And so there are people that are like hoping this is going to come, like they're really 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 hoping this is going to come, and because then we're going to be just kind of it's going to just be kind of like this other level just like sheds off, and then what we're left with is this harmony. But I mean, it doesn't take place instantaneously. It may be this 100 years or 10 years or whatever, but then we're all pulling together and everybody is able to pursue their freedom. And then those that really want to become really want to go out and explore Mars.
Sounds lovely, and I wish I could believe that. I think we're as close to that as we're ever going to get. We're as interconnected as I think we will ever be. The problem is with fossil fuels, this is a once in a planet's lifetime deal. And we've already used the vast majority of it. And well, the vast majority of it that will ever be economic to extract. So when we have simplified, as we will be forced to do, we will no longer be able to do the complex things that we would have to do to extract the remaining fossil fuels.
And yet, the ants that are in the leafcutter ant colonies, they are, I mean, there's a lot of complexity, but it's not, they're still a superorganism, but it's not like they have every single individual ant has a different job. So it is similar. It's, I mean, you can describe it in a book. Like you can't describe this global civilization in a single book. There's just so much data, right? But you can describe an ant mound other than, you know, maybe this is how, I mean, even that, you could model it. You could make a model of the ant mound, a mold or whatever, and you could describe that in a certain amount of data. And so I think it can still, I think that's still the way, the future that might happen anyway, even though it simplifies, even though there's less energy per capita.
The leafcutter ants depend on their energy supply, same as any group of organisms do. And the problem is, we used to do that. We used to depend on our natural energy supply. And if we didn't overpopulate, then we would have been able to continue doing that. But the problem is we found an artificial energy source that we then exploited to the nth degree to build this incredible edifice of complexity. But as we move down the slope of Colbert's curve, we're not even going to be able to maintain what we've built, let alone build any more of it. So simplification will mean losing a lot of that complexity. And the paradox is that complexity is what you need to be able to access low EROEI energy sources like unconventional oil and gas or solar PV or these huge wind turbines and things. I mean, sure, you can build a windmill like the Dutch used to do, but they didn't do that to make electricity. They used it to grind mill wheels. There are ways you can use renewable energy simply without the level of complexity, but it's not going to give you what people rely on, what people consider normal now. So what we really have to do, because low energy return on energy invested energy sources are going to be all we have at some point, we're going to have to find out how to use them as efficiently and effectively as possible, which does not mean electricity grid. It means using renewable energy for thermal energy, motive power, compressed air systems, things like that, because all of those are much higher energy return on energy invested than trying to make electricity and send it all over the world. We're going to be constrained to being only able to access things that we can access in a much simpler way. We will not be fracking. We will not be drilling thousands of feet down below the seafloor in the Arctic to try and tap some untapped reservoir. We're not going to be putting a drill rig out in Iceberg Alley and things to try and get oil from there either.
And that sounds pretty good as far as the biosphere and the climate are concerned, actually.
Oh, well, yes, but it will also not support 7.5 billion people or anything even close to that, unfortunately. The implications of this are somewhat stark. And I mostly don't really talk about that because it just tends to depress people and things. So I just prefer to say, look, let's get over the first hurdle. Let's deal with what we're facing now. So we're going to have an economic depression. We're going to have to deal with a pandemic for the time being. If we can manage to get through to the other side of all that, then we can worry about what comes next. Because although I regard the idea of going back down to carrying capacity as baked in the cake at this point, I don't see any way to avoid it at all. If we dwell on only that in the far future, then we lose what it means to live in the present. I mean, there are always risks. And if we dwell entirely on the very long-term risks, we're not dealing with the things right now that we really need to be dealing with. And I think that's a big problem. So this is one of the reasons that I very rarely mention hyperinflation. and when we talk about deflation and inflation, people say, well, isn't it going to be hyperinflation? I've never raised it myself because that's further in the future. And people will tend to immediately grab onto that because that's what they hear everybody talking about all the time. All the financial analysts are saying, oh, well, we're going to have all this inflation from all this money printing. People get very hung up on that because that's what they hear in the mainstream media. And then they ignore the deflation that's going to come first. And then the analogy I use for this is you're walking along, if you're looking at the horizon and you're not looking where you're putting your feet, well, deflation is the equivalent of one of these tiger traps that's covered with grass with the pointy stakes underneath. And if you're looking at the horizon, not where you're putting your feet, then there are really big traps waiting for people who are not looking at what's coming right now. So I prefer to focus on the shorter term things that are hopefully going to get people through the first hurdle with some remaining agency. Because if you lose everything in the first go, your agency is basically gone, and then you will be at the mercy of whatever life has to throw at you, and all you'll be able to do is react to it to the extent that you can, which might not even be much. If you want to be proactive and you want to retain the luxury of the longer term, then you really have to have some kinds of cushions and sort of have taken some steps to prepare. So, and ways to get over that first hurdle. And the world could look so different by the time that we've got over that first hurdle, that there may be things that emerge that are just absolutely not predictable at this point, good or bad. So I think we need to see what happens when we have more information. If we get over the first hurdle, see where we are then, see what information we have at that point, and then try and get over the next hurdle, whatever that may be. And it may be different in different places. In some places, it's definitely going to be energy supply. Places that don't have a lot of energy, in an era when oil is no longer fungible and you're not moving energy around the world, what you have locally is all you have. Some places are going to have an almighty energy crisis. Other places not so much because they're more endowed with resources. But at the same time, if you're endowed with resources and you're too close to other people who want what you have, those resources can be a curse, not a benefit. So there's just so many layers of complexity, so many things that can happen, and they'll all be interacting the whole time. So I think past a certain point, there are only some things that are predictable. And you can look at the very larger things like carrying capacity and eventually having to meet carrying capacity one way or another. You can predict things at that level, but because so many of the specifics are missing, it's very hard to flesh anything out. And so at the moment, I mostly prefer not to go there, just because I think it becomes a bit of a distraction. I really want people to focus on what we have to do to get through the situation that we face now, because that's going to be enough for anybody to focus on right now. I mean, a depression and a pandemic at the same time is really going to be more of risk than pretty much anyone really remembers dealing with. I mean, unless you're a veteran of some horrible war or something, or you maybe escaped from some ghastly totalitarian regime, most people have not seen these kind of things happen in their lifetime. And often their parents haven't even really either. So a lot of these things have slipped beyond human memory. They're not part of human lived experience anymore for an awful lot of people, especially in the developed world. And so I think we lose sight of what can happen, and it comes as a much bigger shock when it's something that we're just not used to. But we are going to have to get used to dealing with one hell of a lot of risk that people are not used to dealing with. And a lot of countries, say the States, people were terribly worried about terrorism after 9/11. It really was not a big deal. The rest of the world, places like Jerusalem where you had to get on a bus and you never knew if it was going to be your bus that was going to blow up that day, but you still got on it every single morning and went to work. How would Americans deal with that level of risk, up close, personal, every single day? But you get used to it over time. It doesn't mean you like it, but you still keep getting on the bus every day, even if bad things might happen and you know it. So when people get a little bit more used to dealing with risk, rather than just being afraid of things that aren't even real. So people were suddenly afraid there were terrorists hiding under every rock, just about, it seemed to me anyway, after 9/11. And really, that's not the case at all. That was an incident. But there hasn't been an enormous explosion of Islamic terrorism in the United States. If anything, the terrorists now are white supremacists, I think. So But I think people, once they get used to more of a level of real risk, then they will manage things better. But the shock doctrine is really, the part of it that I would call the shock doctrine is going to be the adjustment from going from low risk society, where people feel they can control all these risks, to suddenly having to live with massive risks you cannot control. And I think that will be an uncomfortable transition. But when people got to the other side of it, they will probably calm down a bit and manage things better.
I think this would be a good time to move towards wrapping up. And I think the last topic that I think is relevant is, if we look back in the history of civilization, there have been times where there have been charismatic leaders who have arisen, who have been people, like Jesus of Nazareth and the Buddha and others. And they have, their general message has been, we need to work together. We are loving, we are supportive, we are a community, we're all in this together. It's not the rentier class that is really relevant. They don't control us. I mean, we control our own selves. In our own selves, we need to understand our own human nature, animal nature, mammal nature. And to the extent that that's going to happen probably anyway, to a certain extent, there's already people probably out there that are very, very altruistic like that. But maybe we don't know their names at a certain point. But ought we be looking for them wherever they happen to be and propping them up, and recognizing that, you know, they might not be making it to the next century either, no matter how old they are. But that is the motion that we want to go in, rather than in this fascist direction. What are your reflections on that?
Well, I think it's wonderful to find people who really are profoundly empathic and put them in positions of leadership. I actually think that's pretty much what we have in New Zealand today. I mean, we have a truly empathic leader who wants to put human well-being above GDP growth, for instance, has explicitly said so. To what extent that will work, I couldn't really say at this point. I think it's going to be a lot harder than anybody would think, for obvious reasons. But nevertheless, people like that are very effective leaders in a crisis. And they're not the kind of people who will grab power for themselves. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to put people on a pedestal and assume that this person is a savior. And because then that people tend to think, well, I don't have to do anything because the savior is there. We've put them on a pedestal to solve all our problems. And then when they don't, they get ripped down from the pedestal and kicked out, and someone else gets put up there. I think
in these religious examples, I mean, the things that the actual historical Jesus did, the real things that he actually did, the things that the historical Buddha actually did, and those that are the originators of other world religions. I mean, I believe these were actual real people who were actually really reaching out to those that they, I mean, even to a certain extent, MLK Jr. and Gandhi were these sorts of leaders. And I mean, they're the opposite. They're the ones that don't take positional power, but they accept that they are speaking with the voice of the desire for spreading love and altruism.
You want to give power to someone who doesn't want it. That's what it really comes down to. Someone who does not want to be in a position to have power over someone else, but nevertheless has the skills. And if you put them into a position of power, not so that you can worship them or encourage them to believe their own propaganda and have things get out of hand, but if you can put them in that position and trust them not to grab power and to maintain empathy and try and bring people along with them, I think these are exactly the kind of leaders you want. Unfortunately, our system all too often tends to select for psychopaths. Also, I mean, the traits that make people psychopaths make them chase power. So you get it from both sides. People want a strong leader, and the kind of people who want to be in control of other people tend to go along and be, or at least be perceived to be, what people want, and they end up in power and they do horrible things. So I think we have to be really careful who is elevated to power. And I think in many places nobody's been anywhere near careful enough, because the way the bubble's gone along for so long, people have had money. People who have money anyway have done very well. And they tend to be the ones who are capable of putting people in power who will keep it that way because they like the status quo. They've benefited from it enormously. And you end up with the people at the bottom really being disempowered. They don't end up having any ability to influence things. I think Peter Thiel was talking about, because we mentioned Peter Thiel earlier, he's saying, oh, democracy is so messy. You can't actually take votes away from people, but you have to make sure they can't vote for anything that actually matters. So that's very much his view, that you have the appearance of democracy, but not functionally. Functionally, you have an oligarchy, or you may have outright fascism, but people still get to feel like they're voting, they feel like they're involved. The institutions may still appear to be there the same way as they were, but they no longer function the way that they did. Mostly they get completely gutted and just become self-serving parts of a bureaucracy that doesn't serve any useful function. So this is kind of where we are at the moment. We've had the wrong kind of leadership. We've had the consolidation of power in the form of corporate fascism. So Trump is more Mussolini than he is Hitler. So it's about corporatism, about the merger of the corporate class and the state. That's the kind of fascism that there is at the moment, that things have been moving towards very rapidly. That whole system has almost become divorced from everything that supports it. And it seems to feel that it's independent of everything at the bottom, but it's not. The only reason that these people are wealthy is because there was a bottom of the pyramid that they could feed from. If you get rid of the bottom of the pyramid, you don't end up with a whole bunch, or a lot less, but very spectacularly wealthy people. What you end up with is you break down the whole system that made anybody wealthy, and you all end up at the bottom somewhere eventually. So people seem to think that you can be divorced from the system that feeds you, and you simply can't. And I think the people at the top have lost sight of their dependence on the people at the bottom. They're starting to realize it now with the pandemic, where all these people who are paid minimum wage are suddenly essential workers that have to work in grocery stores, pick fruit, all sorts of things are essential, and people are suddenly waking up to that. Before, these people just seemed expendable or disposable, but now they're the ones who are putting their lives on the line for the sake of everybody else. And I really, really hope that people remember that after this is over and treat these people with the respect they're actually due.
All right. I think we could probably continue chatting for even more hours, but
I'm sure we could.
I think that's enough for now. I mean, there's a lot of food for thought there. There's a lot of different lines we've went down. And
yep.
I
like going down all sorts of different lines.
Oh yeah.
All together.
Well, I think people have to be curious. I mean, animals are curiosity engines, right? They're pattern-seeking engines.
Yes.
Humans, in particular, we're trying to make sense of everything and have everything fit. So there's no cognitive dissonance, so that everything makes sense all together, and that so we can see as far in the future as we can possibly see. And
absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, I want to understand it all, you know, how I want to be able to see the future and see the paths and see, you know, this is the way. I mean, I know the way I want to go. I mean, there's certain goals I have. I still want to be able to,
if they're great goals.
Yeah, well, and even
even
more personally, I mean, there's certain things that I really want to do. Like, I've never been to New Zealand. You know, and
it's great. You would love it.
If there is a way for there to be a future where there's still a possibility of me traveling there, whether it's by plane or boat or submarine or whatever, in balloon, I want to have that opportunity. And, you know, for my kids as well, you know, I definitely want them to have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful future, better than the life that I've ever led. I don't want the income inequality. I mean, I love the idea of a utopia. And there's actually a book called Utopia, which I remember reading 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah. And not to say that it's a perfect book, but I also like, you know, as far as the Star Trek future, the aspect of it that's on Earth, where nobody has money to pay, everybody has all everybody can explore their own artistic, and it's kind of other than teleporting. it's kind of a low energy future, really. I mean, because they don't have vehicles all that much. I want to get to that.
I would love that. I must say I can't really believe that it's going to happen, but it would be awfully nice if it did.
Well, clearly I need to work on my why it's going to happen argument that is soundproof and logically sound and everything. But
well, hold on to that vision, because that will keep you going through dark times. And that's important. You need to have a vision of something could be better. It doesn't have to be like this. And it's not just trying to survive every day. It's about being able to take the longer term view and think how things might be better. And that's a great thing to hold on to.
all right. Well, I want to say thank you so much for all of your time today, Nicole. I mean,
You're welcome.
that was over 3 hours we spent together today.
Fine by me. I love this stuff.
And now we just have to figure out, who's the right audience to share this with. Because if the fascists and the rentiers are out there, maybe this should be shared amongst our trusted circles first.
Whatever you choose is fine by me.
All right.
You might like to meet some of the living economies people. I think you might like to interview Phil Stevens, for instance. I mean, you wouldn't know Phil. He's an American from Arizona who lives here now, but he's an IT guy, and he totally gets all this stuff. And he's really interesting. He has a lot of perspectives that I think you'd really like to explore.
Well, if you
the whole living economies group, I will connect you with them for sure.
If you connect me with him and convince him to talk with me over Zoom or email or whatever.
I'm sure he would.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, because
you could probably interview several of them. They're very different. I mean, Phil is the one who's most like me, who has this sort of intellectual sort of approach to these sorts of things. Several of the other people are unbelievable community organizers. So they're not so much interested in all the abstractions. It's sort of, don't bother me with details. Just let me know what I have to do, and I'm going to get on with it, and I'm damn good at getting on with it, and they do. So there's some amazing people here. I think you interviewing them would be great. They understand this in so much depth, and New Zealand operates at a human scale. So people can do things here that they wouldn't be able to do in larger places where they have more oppressive governments. So yeah, I will introduce you to the living economies people, and I think you would like quite a lot of them.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And if you haven't figured it out yet, if you are actually getting to view this, then number one, we trust you to use it to do good and be altruistic and help to make the future a better place, and not to move in the direction of fascism or any other dystopian future that we hope not to arrive at.
I mean, just because I think we're heading for dystopia doesn't mean I want it or anything. I mean, I do see us moving in directions that I'm not happy with, but if there's anything that can be done to make it not happen that way, I'm all for it.
So, okay, thank you so much for your time. Oh, and if you are seeing this on YouTube, if we do decide to post it, then please hit the like and the bell and the subscribe and leave a comment and the comments and questions, because who knows, maybe we will put this online. Maybe people will have questions. Maybe we'll Nicole and I will chat again.
I'm happy to do Q&A and stuff like that. I have no problem with that. In fact, if you want to tell people that they can submit questions, and then we can do a session where we answer people's questions, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Interactive stuff is great because it draws more people in.
All right.
I think that would be useful.
I'm going to sleep on it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Oh, you're welcome.
Take care.
Bye.
All right. So I think that was good.
Okay. See you next time.
Thank you for spending all the time with me again.
No problem at all. I'm happy to. Sorry, it's a bit depressing sometimes.
No, I think it's necessary to face one's fears and worst fears in order to have perspective on what one really wants to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're going to change things, we have to know what we're trying to change. We have to understand the system as it is if we can hope to do something differently.
All right. So. Well, until we talk next time, take care.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if you need anything, let me know.
Okay. Will do.
Bye-bye.
See you later then. Bye.